Hello and welcome to the Homemade Camera Podcast. We have a very special guest today, Graham Burnett, who runs graflexparts.com. Is it .com, Graham?
Yeah, it is .com, yes.
Graham has a home-ish shop, and instead of having 15 3D printers, he's got a bunch of milling equipment to make some really beautiful stuff. He is in Duluth, Minnesota, so 9 million miles north of every listener to this podcast.
I have to say, Graham, I grew up in Minneapolis, and
Did you?
Yeah, I did. And I have to tell you that the thing I know about Duluth is that there's no accident that the first three letters in Duluth are dull.
What do you mean is dull? Graham had to dig out his Wi-Fi router this morning. It was under 10 feet of snow.
Yeah.
Oh, exactly. It snowed?
Oh, no, not yet. Not yet.
No,
it'll soon enough, though. Usually how it goes.
I don't know. I gather it's sort of like the Pacific Northwest without salt water, but
Okay,
that's also what I've heard. But anyway,
let's jump into cameras. Graham, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into machining and making things? We'll get into making cameras a little bit later.
I guess the principle of everything I do is I like to be self-sufficient, and that's why I've gone through to work to make my own shop in where I can spend hours dedicated to a lathe in the mill, and it's just controlling the manufacturing process. But that kind of stems from just I was a college dropout. I didn't really want to go get a normal job. I didn't really see myself committing all the time to education like that. And at that years back when I was doing that, I was just trying to be a freelance photographer, and I was thinking, well, you can teach yourself photography. You don't need to go to school for this. It has its merit, But so I took my own path with that. I ended up, my brother. This is so many tangents to jump around at one time, but I started shooting film when I was 13 years old. My brother gave me my first camera, which was a Minolta SRT 101. And I really took to the whole manual side of things. I kind of floundered over to digital for a few years, and came back. But then by the time that I was dropping out of college and trying to find something, what should I do? I was looking. This is still when you could buy Fuji film or Fuji instant film for super cheap. So I bought a Mamiya press, and I was trying to shoot FP100C and make a little gig off that. But life works its weird ways, and I ended up getting into Graflexes, and I like working on cameras more than I like shooting them. I don't know, but that's
that's perfectly okay. What it is. That's perfectly okay.
Yeah, and I'm still really interested in the fine art side of things. I just, for myself, I couldn't push it into a job of trying to make my artwork actually pay money. Whereas I like doing craftsman type things. I worked full time as a barista, and I managed a restaurant for a couple of years. And that's the kind of thing where it's a hands-on craft. You're a shopkeeper. It's kind of the same essence of this, and it just by extension, I'm running my little shop, but instead of serving the general public, it's online niche stuff. I got my start machining in high school. Actually, I was really fortunate. I grew up in central Minnesota, where the normal jobs that you'd get are working for the granite company, or welding, or working in agriculture. And so I had a really great shop teacher who his father had taught my father years back. So we all essentially had the same schooling of machining and stuff. But at 13, 14 years old, I was let on a full-size mill, full-size lathe, and kind of taught the basics. And it's one of those things where it's like learning to ride a bike, and you don't really forget after all the years. So this past couple of years, when I started to get into camera modification, and I started out doing 3D printing like everyone else does. It's easy for prototyping, but you start to realize, especially when you're paying for an SLS print from someone like Shapeways or any of the other online companies, you have this timeline that you really can't control for R&D, where you send your project out, you get it back, it's off by a couple millimeters in some dimension that's not going to work for you at all, and you can't do anything but wait another 2.5, 3 weeks for another prototype to come. And so I ended up, I started working with, we have a makerspace in town. I know, Ethan, you work with your makerspace in your locale. And our makerspace is a much, not unprofessional, it's just a very small part of Duluth. We have different sewing manufacturers and all these little craftsman industries that have existed in Duluth since 1890s. And it's kind of, so it's this great color of people, and it's really cheap to be at the makerspace. But my brother worked there, volunteered there for a lot of years, and by extension through that, I was like, hey, can I use your milling machine if I need to get some stuff done? And he's like, yeah, go for it. It's like, do I need to take a class? And they're like, no, don't take a class at all. It's like, you're just going to let me on the Bridgeport. And I forcibly got my brother to walk me through stuff, so I didn't feel like I was going to kill myself on any of the machines. But and that was a good few years back now. But I mean, now I've got a milling machine in the background there, and it's a whole different league when you're not having to rent time on a machine, and you can just dedicate all the effort that goes into it. So did I go off on enough tangents there?
Maybe half as many as we should.
Oh no. I guess my desire for, because you guys deal with mostly, it seems, medium format, except for Nick's the one shooting the Graflexes and stuff. But it's kind of a weird jump to go from like small format up to like anything it's more technically minded. But then, so the first time that I was introduced to a Graflex was 7 years ago now. My brother handed me this. He's like, it's just like your Mamiya. Like, it's just all the controls are in different spots. And I'm looking at this thing like, I have no idea what you're showing me right now. Like, I don't know what any of these controls do. And now I can take one of those cameras apart in my sleep. So
how long did it take you to suss it out? How long did it take you to figure out, you know, the controls are different, the film wind is different, obviously. But so when you were, you know, faced with this different camera, how long did it take you to figure it out?
It's kind of one of those things where you figure out what you don't know personally about cameras and like what you can learn more about. I mean, it was some of those things where I was unaware that the camera was taking control of tension adjustment. You know, like when you wind a 35mm camera, you think you're doing all of the manual things anyway, but there's 80 years of automatic development that's gone into all of these mechanics that are setting all of these things automatically, running all these escapements and mechanisms and stuff. So it didn't take me too long. I think it's more once I finally got into the nitty gritty of caring about how wrong I was shooting other formats. And then I had my biggest goal was I wanted to shoot FP100C on a Graflex, and I got myself to that point. But also, when you buy any camera that you're looking to modify, you end up having to learn more about it. And so I actually had to get a training on with my brother one day, where I came into Duluth before we lived in Duluth, and he spent like 5-6 hours with me at the makerspace. We tore the camera apart, put it back together. And that was one thing, when you have someone else's hands showing you what to do. And then there's the whole ordeal played over by myself that takes 2 or 3 times as long when I'm sitting there by myself with screwdrivers trying to not break things.
Yeah, and you need the big tray to catch all the little bits. And I also find it's a great idea to take a lot of photographs so that you can find your way back out with the breadcrumbs when you're trying to put it back together. Yeah.
And that's something that I've started to do now with it's something that you do out of survival for yourself at the start of like, I don't know how is this going to go back together, but you end up realizing like there's a bunch of cameras that I have where part of what I pride myself on at this point is that I can kind of just get any camera into my shop as long as it's got a large format focal plane shutter, might have mirror linkage, it's not too small. There's few requirements, but most of these designs I learned I can work on. And a big part of that is before you start taking things apart, you take a bunch of photos of it. So, you know, once you popped a certain escapement off and you drop the entire gear set, it's like, crap, which way do these go? I mean, there's times
every step.
Yeah,
I find if I don't do every step, I sometimes can't find my way back. It's yeah. And then there's that little sound. And I just yesterday have a new ancient Russian lens, and I took it out of the packaging, and I felt the tiny screw drop out and caught it all completely blind and found the little hole and put it right back in.
Well, this is actually yesterday I was because part of it being your own repair technician and then being a machine operator, by extension, you are your own machine repair technician then. So doing just certain normal service on my lathe and stuff, I'm going through everything, oiling up every little spot, trying to find, because that's especially when you're working with machine tools that run for hours and hours, the spots that you don't normally oil are the ones that end up biting you in the butt. Things that wear themselves out after a couple thousand hours of being around. Same with cameras. No, I'm in the middle of like pulling little oiler grub screws out, and I get one out, and I forgot that I was using a magnetized screwdriver, and I didn't realize it wasn't a non-ferrous screw, and it just popped right out, and I spent about an hour looking for it, and now I'm at the point of, okay, I'm just going to have to cut another grub, which on the lathe, I can just make myself another grub screw, but it's how much effort do I want
Yeah,
to put
10
into it?
hours. I'd rather cut a bolt like this on a lathe than a grub screw.
It's cutting tiny things is fun. I don't know.
For
That's
you.
well, but I've also said this in the past. I don't like working on tiny cameras. There's a point where things are just too small for my hands.
Or eyes, or my tremor, and all the rest of it. There is something wonderful about the Graflex combination of materials. The way they combine metal and wood, it suits me. I'm a blacksmith and a carpenter essentially, and that's just what you're doing with a Graflex. You're doing a lot of that kind of metalwork and carpentry. It's amazing how well they figured stuff out. Some of those teeny tiny screws that have held for 50, 60 years and are still good when you take them out, put them back in. They really thought that through.
It was their whole, especially when it comes to, I mean, I think this can extend over to the whole just family of that world of large format box cameras that were built on a box of wood before everything went to composites and just metal. I mean, this is everything pre-1950 when aluminum was still considered an exotic metal.
Yeah.
You know. But especially with Graflex is that you have the combination of there's so many things that can be broken and can be readily fixed by just the user. It doesn't need to go off to a repair tech. It's not like was it like the Pentax 67 where it has the focusing chain and stuff that'll break where you might be able to get into the camera to do it, but you're not going to have any of the parts. You're not going to be able to remedy the situation at all. And with Graflexes, one of the most common problems is stripped out screw holes, which you can fix with either super glue or wood glue, which are $2 fixes.
Yeah. And
the screws you can buy off the internet still.
Yep. And you pretty much just need flathead screwdrivers.
Yeah.
For the whole
thing. I know we're going to go way down the wormhole into some of your projects, and I'm sure Nick has a million questions about, and you guys could probably talk for 10 days about how these things work and things you might build based upon them. But I kind of want to know, like, you have probably some real mechanical abilities that are natural or picked up from other things, right? And you've figured out how to work on cameras, but I think the reason, Graham, why you are particularly good and knowledgeable about this is for some reason, some crazy reason, you started a business around fixing and making repair parts for these old cameras, which we haven't really talked about. I wonder sort of how you got into making repair parts and repairing cameras sort of professionally before we get down into the nitty gritty of cameras in particular.
Yeah, it's, I mean, it did start out with, I was trying to, which like a lot of these hobbies, it's something that kind of just spirals out of control, but in a good way. So it started with, I had gone from trying to shoot FP100C film on a Mamiya press. I really got sick of using a rangefinder. I have this like, I really don't like TLRs, and it's the parallax of a rangefinder. I just don't like, especially with the Mamiya press. The RF is so far away from the shooting lens that when you're close enough up to something trying to do a portrait, it's totally crossed. So my next inclination was, okay, I need a large format SLR, single lens reflex camera, where I am looking down into the camera and out the exact lens that I'm shooting on. And so I transitioned to first Graflex I got was a 3x4 Series D, just cute little SLR.
Cute little is kind of relative.
Little in my world. When the big cameras in my world are about the size of a small child, you consider a 3x4 camera to be little. No, I started out with, it was a little project, and this was, what was I trying to do in town? I think, yeah, I was trying to freelance when we moved to Duluth. Do little social media stuff, freelancing. It wasn't really working out. No one was paying me. I was ended up having to get, it's like, okay, I'm gonna have to get another job to hold me over for something to do whatever. And I ended up working for one of the bag manufacturers in town, doing like leather work and real hands-on craftsmanship. And you get really sick of factory work pretty quick. And in my own hobby time, I was trying to transition from Mamiya to Graflex, and I 3D printed myself on what was it on? Oh, an old MakerBot, those tiny, crappy little slow printers. And so I printed my first little 3x4 adapter, which I have a version of. Now this is only half of it, but this is the shape. It's a large, because the back of a Graflex camera has a big rotation ring that is just a big circle that's got a bolt pattern on it, and then this rotates.
Okay, and for our listeners, the people who aren't able to watch, it's a rectangle. Is it 4x5? Yeah. It's bigger than 4x5, right? It's
the old FP100C holders. So this is a Fuji holder off of a passport camera. Okay. So it's like passport photos where they take 4 on one picture, and it's so I ripped the back off, and they all have a pretty usual back. You're making a rectangle. Its shape is a rectangle. It's got a couple screw holes, and what I'm fitting it onto is a circular bolt pattern on the back of the camera. And there's some niches that go into. Technically, it can't rotate unless you pull it off the camera. That's a whole other thing. But the idea is you're making a 3x4. You're taking a full 3x4 Polaroid image on the back, and it's a little obtuse. They're kind of big, but not to go off on that. So I prototyped this first one out of just FDM printing a long time ago, and I was like, proof of concept worked. It was taking some pictures. I managed to calibrate the camera to work right, and then because of the communities I was involved with online, everyone else figured out that I was making a Polaroid adapter, and this is when you could still buy it for $10 a pack. So everyone's like, I want one of these now. It's like, sure, I can tool up and do this. And that's kind of when the whole Graflex Parts thing, I wanted to maybe start like a CLA business out of it, which is super naive because to CLA a camera, you have to be able to make the parts for the camera. So I was just trying to make modification parts then. And then I started getting a lot of orders for that. And then it turns back into people wanting to keep sending me their cameras again. And you have to just become comfortable with the work at a point. And I was simultaneously for my own cameras, because at this point, you buy one Graflex, you end up with 8 or 9 of them in your shop, just on your own. And most of them, like a lot of these antique cameras, you buy them and the soft components like the bellows, the hood, things that are made out of leather and cardboard, and especially in a Graflex where you have a shutter curtain that's made out of rubberized silk, it rots after 90 years. And so I ended up with a lot of cameras in my shop that are completely rotten out. They don't have working shutters. And so I went on another endeavor separate to modification parts, and I went through, it was about 2 years of work that it required. It took me about a year to figure out the materials, because the Graflex shutter curtain material is long gone, technically. The material I'm using is technically the correct material as spec'd in the late 1970s by the last iteration and history of where they were going after they sold off. But making a shutter curtain is an extremely involved craft, and it was something where I was really naive, like, oh, this will be easy. It'll be an arts and crafts project, and I got into it. I think I started making the fabric out of Thorlab's BK5, that nice blackout curtain that you can get for super cheap. Does not work for shutter curtains. And I will tell everyone on the podcast this. It does not work for shutter curtains. You can try it for some smaller dual curtain cameras. You might have success, but you probably won't. The other bigger issue is when you're ripping a curtain out of a camera, you don't realize at first, but there's metal ribs on every aperture. So the shutter curtain in a Graflex camera is about a 5-foot long roll curtain that has about 4 or 5 different apertures cut into it, like different rectangular holes. And when that hole passes through the back of the camera, that's what allows the exposure. That's that's the first focal plane shutter systems that existed circa 1898. And with the Graflex though, those metal stiffening ribs, they're brass. They're very, very thin stamped brass. And they're extremely precisely made. They fit the curtains exactly. They need to be installed extremely precisely. And that's something where you start on the endeavor of, I'm going to make a shutter curtain for a camera. And then you don't realize that you have to rip the original ribs out of the camera. And usually when you pull the ribs out of the camera, you break them. So then I was off on another process of, okay, let's make shutter curtain ribs. And that's something
Without
I can't get into.
building a stamping press that weighs 25,000 pounds, I assume.
And that's, yeah. And when Graflex was doing this back in the 20s and 30s, I mean, Fulmer and Schwing Manufacturing, who became Graflex later on, they started up in 1890 and they were making gas lamps and stuff. Their main centralized factory was stamping abilities. So stamping brass, stamping aluminum, and different sheet.
Sewing machine parts, right?
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
So isn't the hard part there the tooling? I mean, you might even be able to use a manual fly press to do the actual stamping if you're not producing huge quantities. But the tooling is the catch. That has to be perfect.
And that's where you can, I mean, if I was doing this, if I was a huge factory and had thousands of dollars for startup costs and investing in all the process, I would have some real stamping dies where it's one punch and it's doing the whole part right off the bat. I have a process that is proprietary. I really can't get into the exact tools I use, but it is a thing where I was hammering out by hand. I was like cutting brass with a blade and sitting and hammering it by hand. And the
jeweler process.
I mean, you smash your fingers enough and you learn how to make it really nicely by hand, very crude. And then the process continues to evolve. You find a way to always make something better. I mean, you should be your own biggest competitor more than anything else. And that was where I wasn't competing with anyone else to try and make shutter curtains or make my ribs look better. It was competing with myself that I wasn't going to put that in someone's camera looking half-assed. And I wasn't going to put it in my own camera looking like something that I don't want to stand behind. And so where I've gotten after, because I've been doing this almost 4 years now, I think. And I've made shutter curtains for 2x3s, 3x5s, 3x4s, all the way up to 5x7 cameras and a few different models. And each one has their own quirks. Everyone is very specific to it. And it is a craft in its own. And that's why it took me a long time to actually get to tool up in my shop to get a lathe, the mill, CNC and stuff like that, because the bulk part of this is, I want to work on cameras. I want to make parts for these cameras, but the biggest factor is there's components that were not being manufactured at all for the past 20 years. Actually, the last person to manufacture these was Fred Lustig, and he passed away in 2014.
I think you and I had a really interesting conversation about how being a cameraman or a camera repairman or woman in 1990 even, or before, was very different than it is now, particularly for older things, in that, I mean, maybe a lot of shops way back in the day had a machine shop, but now it's almost required.
Yeah, it turned into well, and even for a long time, I think you had a lot of shops that existed in the 70s, 80s, 90s that maybe didn't have the tooling, but they at least had part stock built up after. I mean, they were buying, this is the era of camera repair shops that were buying out Grandpa's camera repair shop and just changing it to a different iteration. And then what we also see is that, especially in the last 30 years, since the 1990s, Graflex and all the antique cameras kind of hit a lull where they weren't really popular. Digital was coming up. Film niches got a little more specific for what people were doing. And Graflexes were just cheap at this point. And so, because they were so cheap, none of the active repair techs, or very few of them, I should say, there are still a handful, no one wanted to touch the cameras. So the whole knowledge just kind of went out the door. The shops that were actually repairing them just kind of went under. The people passed away. And now we're left with, I think there's 4 or 5 people in the US that will touch a Graflex. I am one of 2 people in the US that will make a curtain for a Graflex. And not to toot my own horn, but I made I made shutter curtains for a bizarre amount of cameras at this point. But to the whole thing that you said of where these shops used to have milling machines, there's actually, I have a couple old Graflex manuals, one from General Precision in the 1960s, speed graphic repair. And then I have a military manual from the 1950s. And what's funny is in these manuals, you'll see there's a spot for, it's readjusting when you install a Fresnel lens in the graph block backs. When they didn't have it standard, you need to mill them down. And in the tools, it says like screwdriver, like whatever screw, horizontal mill, like just drops it in there. Like, yeah, that's just a complacent tool in your shop, of course.
Sure.
Which is, when you were in the 1950s, this was a thing. But also, Graflex never released repair manuals because their school of thought in the 1930s and 40s was a repair tech should be savvy enough to figure the things out on their own, and the knowledge should be passed from person to person. So you apprentice or train on learning these things. It wouldn't just be this is like, we have some great resources now on Facebook groups of like learn camera repair and the repair directories and stuff like that, where they have manuals out. But the thing is, for Graflexes, there just aren't any. There are for the speed graphics and some of the newer cameras, but when you get old enough into like the SLRs and the central things they work on, there never were repair materials. And there are some very...
It seems like having a repair manual for a bicycle or like a 1970s motorcycle, although some have some good ones, but like it's before the complexity where, you know, anybody, I think, worth their salt who was doing it professionally could probably just, you know, take the panels off and watch.
And that's really it, where it becomes one of those things where, and there's the school of thought is still very much alive in the Graflex niche. The central Graflex community that it's existing right now has been around for 20 or 30 years. Like, some of these guys have known each other for a long time. And one of the schools of thought is, you don't teach someone how to tear their camera apart, because if they can't figure it out on their own, they shouldn't really be messing with it. And there's some circumstance where that has merit for trying to tear into some more in-depth cameras, but as most SLRs, unless you know how to get into the camera, you really shouldn't be in the camera at all. But with speed graphics and other things, this also extends into just how Graflex changed through the years. We go from wooden cameras of the 1930s to we start getting composite framed cameras in the 60s and 70s. And then things become more modular, where you don't need to go get your rangefinder adjusted by the shop. You have rangefinder cams that you pop into your top rangefinder. And in it, but that's also there's hours that we could talk about how the demise of Graflex altogether and how things ended in the 70s. But
yeah, and the same thing happened to Leica. They went from a camera design where you could adjust all the parameters and you know, directly, to ones where you had to throw the part away and put a new part in. And it was practical for them, but it left a lot of these cameras orphaned, as the old guys that know how to take them apart disappear, you know.
Oh, entirely.
It's constantly a design question for me when designing new things is, do I design modules or pieces of things, either, you know, industrially or even for cameras, that are, you know, weather sealed because I've dunked them in epoxy, or quick and cheap to put together because I glued them, but totally irreparable? Or, you know, do I spend a little bit more time on the front end with, you know, easy to use assembly and multiple parts, and then be able to repair it? It's always a tough decision.
I'm a huge fan of some adjustments so that you can change your mind or fix things without starting from scratch. I like that.
Yeah, no, that's totally something where Graflex, if you look at the manuals too, there are parts lists. So once you get into the 1960s, you can find active parts lists that are describing what exact screw you need for exact pieces. But most of my email ends up being tech support, just completely free tech support of, hey, I lost this screw. What is this? Where do I get one of these? What is this part called? And, you know, like some of these things where it's like, I've been working on whatever camera for 5 days. Like, I need to go look at the manual again and refresh myself. And I find myself digging through for a half hour of the manual looking for a specific rivet. And then you realize the entire component is not listed by Graflex, because the idea was that you're going to go bring it to, well, especially if you're in the military, you're going to go bring it to the parts guy and drop it on his desk and be like, please order me one of these. And they would just get an entire replacement door, an entire like component itself, not replacing little pieces. So there's a weird amount of stuff that was just never depicted in even manuals. Or even in pictures. You can't even find some of these things in diagrams. They just exist on the camera.
One thing I think that adds to that is that they kept their designs pretty consistent for long periods of time. So they really would stick to something and leave it the same rather than completely change it. But I'm sure that people got into them and changed stuff around. It's the same thing happens with Leicas. There were technicians that could basically, you know, redesign the camera and swap parts from completely different models and all that kind of thing. I'm sure you find that.
Well, one of the there's a saying when it comes to Graflex. There are no always in Graflex, and there are always no in Graflex. Everything was always squirrely all the time. Especially when up until like things got really streamlined when you're making a batch of 2,000, 5,000 cameras, which is where they were in the 1940s through the 1970s. They were massive batches, but before that, they were being built in batches of 5 cameras to 300 and little small things. So one of the weirdest things in my work is I can work on 3 cameras that all have identical hardware on the surface. They're all completely different underneath. You get into it and it's like, okay, they just deleted this part out of the entire system. And it's like, was it there? And it's like, no, there's just no screw holes for it. And this is specifically too with the speed and crown graphics. When you earlier on, before they got a set box design, you can, if you look at enough of them through the 20s and 30s, the inside of the box just changed. However, whoever was running it for those couple of years decided to build it. Or another part was they would, why you'll see weird hardware combinations on cameras sometimes, and people will be like, "Oh, that didn't exist. Someone put the wrong hardware on that camera. It's been messed with in the 1980s." And no, it hasn't. What it was a camera that got built between one batch of stamped hardware and another batch of stamped hardware, and they just ran out of parts halfway through the batch, and just went to the new. They just transitioned. So it's kind of endearing that like it's really high-end professional photography gear, but at the same time, it's kind of like that little like. It's a little hokey every now and then, like things are kind of like a little spun off on their one-off things. Like maybe someone was a little tired on a Monday morning when they went to work, you know.
But I mean, in that era, almost everything was manufactured like that. You know, we did not have pick and place spots. You know.
No, that's actually. I think I showed you. I've got pictures of it. But there's actually. I wonder if I can pull that up here while we're talking. There's a. I did a home portrait a long time ago that has a. I don't know where I should find this. I had to redo the curtain on a home portrait that was 1927, I think, and I think I dated it out to being produced probably in August. And I pulled the curtain off it, and you got to peel it off to get the full dimension. And I'm peeling off the glue area, and I'm both immediately disgusted. Because there's grasshopper wings stuck inside the curtain on the glue. And then I was immediately impressed because I thought to myself, these are 90-year-old grasshopper wings. And then the whole picture kind of got together where it's like, okay, they're gluing curtains up, the windows are open, it's hot, it's the middle of August, a grasshopper landed on the curtain, and then probably whoever like go and pick the grasshopper off, I'm like, crap, the wings are still there. Roll it up, who's gonna notice? Except for me in 90 years. It's really a weird. I don't know.
that's really great. I like that sort of thing.
And then you get into which like off on when you get into cameras like the European SLRs. Oh, here actually, can I screen share for a second?
Yes, please.
Here,
it's present now on the bottom right hand.
Yeah, I see it. Here, this is the grasshopper wings. Can you see it?
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So it's a little morbid, a little gross, but then also it's still a, you know, that grasshopper was immortalized for a good amount of years. Is the presenting done? Am I back on camera?
Yeah,
you're
okay.
back.
I'm such a novice to all this video chat stuff. I feel like I live in the 1960s half the time. So, but that's when it comes to when we get over to like the European SLRs, technically Graflex was mass produced. They were high-end professional cameras, but they weren't nearly as high-end as something, say, like a Kershaw Soho reflex, or like a Thornton and Pickard, which there's discrepancies that go into their design where it's here or there. But what you find when you go inside of those cameras is there'll be notes, like technician notes. Everything will have like every panel of the camera will be either stamped or numbered in pencil. And then you'll usually on Kershaw's, the entire mirror box drops out the bottom of the camera, so you can work on it and tension and stuff. And there 9 out of 10 times there's a proof signature and then a date of when it was proofed in the factory. And I've managed to a few different members in other groups. We've traced the exact same initials on like 7 different years of these cameras, which is, who knows who that person is? I think it's like a JP, but that's especially, I mean, when you see handwriting on a camera from the 1920s, and you realize how wrong society has gotten a normal handwriting script when someone's like little note is in gorgeous cursive writing. Total different.
Well, part of that has to do with pen technology, which we could get into between Spencerian and Danielian script, but that's maybe for a different podcast.
But yeah, but it still gets into the whole just the delicacy of manufacture. And then you look at all of these leather cameras too, and it's something you don't notice at first until you really spend enough hours looking at these, but they all have these beautiful embossed squares. And when you see a 35 millimeter camera wrapped in leather, there's like the different retailers that sell leather kits. They're little laser cut kits. You put it on, it glues it, it goes into the spot it's supposed to go. When you're wrapping something like a Graflex, you're wiping glue on the entire camera, and you're stretching stuff and cutting box corners and doing a place like Graflex had, you had your machining department, and then you had your box making department, and then you had your curtain crafting area, and then also like they were all their own separate little facilities in the main manufacturing plant. So instead of just it's the camera facility where things are getting shipped out and machined on like these days on CNC and stuff, and everything's just being popped out in factories, and then one person sitting there just putting everything together. It was all of these little entities existing of, when you strip a Graflex down to wood for the first time, you start realizing that whoever was picking the panels of mahogany that went on these cameras, they knew the mahogany wasn't going to be shown to anybody, but there are some of these gorgeous cuts. And they're like quarter sawn panels. Like there's really beautiful woodwork that is just hidden.
I've been in some of the last of those old style factories where they have the different specialized areas. I did work in the last plant in this country that made really big equipment from beginning to end. In other words, starting from pig iron and ending up with finished.
Oh, rock on.
In this case, they were big machine pumps, really large scale. But the thing that you saw right away was that each of those separate shops had a completely different subculture, and there were very different kinds of people in them, and it was fascinating. It was almost like taking the different guilds in a medieval town and assembling them under a factory roof. It was a very different and wonderful.
Well, and that speaks to like here in Duluth, we have a couple big names of we're a main sewing manufacturer. We used to be a sleazy port city in the 70s, is kind of the stigma that our city has, but Duluth Pack, canvas good manufacturer, they've existed since like the 1890s. And they've been in town, and they're still around. And then we have, alternatively, there's another heritage bag manufacturer, Frost River, and then you have, there's someone that makes really high-end motorcycle suits in town. But they're all of these sewing industries. So I worked for Frost River for a good while, and I was their sewing runner. So I'm the one putting sewing kits together in the basement, and then running all the way up to the sewing floor and running kits between the finishing and quality control and riveting and all these different things. And so you're in a factory like that, and sewing factories have not aged. Like nothing has gotten. The machines get more modern, but a factory like that down in the basement, the two guys I was working with had been working there for 15 years, and they had been working before that. They were working at Duluth Pack before that. Like so, their whole life was like leather work and crafting, and it's the same way where what's wild is you start to realize that these employees, like any local industry labor force, they're transitioning around from all these businesses. So you have 100 years of cumulative sewing industry and other manufacturing industry knowledge that's being just passed around from all of these little entities and companies. And so that's actually a part of the nice part of being in Duluth here is I've got sitting off camera 2 massive totes full of aircraft leather. Came from we have an upholsterer in town that specializes in upholstering private planes, and they have a bunch of scrap leather and they can't do anything with it. So now I've got a bunch of jet seat leather, and it's and even there I walked into that factory and huge room, and you've got all of these little microcosms of there's the people who are running the little Skyver, you've got the couple sewing guys over there talking, and then the whole corporate side of things. So it's the real industrial manufacturing side of stuff, especially where the machinery doesn't change. When I was working at Frost River, we were using riveting machines from World War II, and things pre-World War II. And I know this is the exact same thing in other shops in town too. We have there's a big tool and die maker over in Superior, Wisconsin, and they're from what I've heard, they have, I think, like 16 Bridgeport mills all set up in a gang for tooling, like old school manufacturing. Just wild to see it still alive and still thriving to an extent when you have.
That's great.
I mean, there's like, because there's a lot of merit for Chinese manufacturing and things that can be done on a much lower cost than we can do here in the U.S. But it's still, it's nice to see that we can keep some of these industries alive for very good reasons too. I mean, when you have tool and die manufacture in your own hometown, you kind of have a little bit quicker connection on things you need right away. So
yeah, and there's another side to it, which is understanding. And a lot of stuff now is designed by people who only know the touch of a keyboard, and they don't understand materials in the same way as someone who's had to scissor it for a year, or, you know, skiver with a knife, or whatever you're talking about. There's a different level of understanding that comes through the touch and the hands-on experience.
And that translates into fewer errors in the design, and
or faster errors.
Well, or controlled knowledge of them too. Just being aware of your limitations of your own product. There's so many things where you write it off on.
Or I was going to say, or the things that the product can do that you wouldn't know if you didn't have firsthand experience working with it. So you can take advantage of things that material will do.
Yeah, so like this shop, the foundry I'm talking about, that it all started with the guy who controlled the mixture of iron in the giant melter. This guy had a Salvador Dali wax mustache with perfect 90-degree angles on it. They had enough demand for their product to run around the clock 7 days a week, and they had to shut the whole freaking place down every night because he went to sleep, and they couldn't do it without him. And you have to picture this giant vat with a man standing over it with sensory equipment, and he's reading all these dials, and then he instructs these trolls to pour bags of powder down into this giant molten iron. We're talking of thousands and thousands of gallons, you know, of molten iron. And then he basically tastes the little spoon like the chef and says, okay, you know, pour it. And then they take a 1,000-gallon dipper and go off and pour an engine block that's the size of a locomotive, you know. And it was just an incredible place. But at the far end of it, at the very other end, they're painting the blocks, and, you know, it goes through machining and all that. So if the machinists run into a problem with the iron, they just walked, you know, half a mile to the other end of the plant and talked to the guy with the amazing mustache and solved it. And it was a completely different world, and didn't involve, you know, having to call someone up on the other side of the planet and translate to a really different language and all that stuff. Yeah,
I think you hit on something there. That's also really important, and I think that also is stemming from getting into how I got into making parts for cameras and what I'm doing, because I'm in a bizarre niche where I am one of the only people doing this. Also part of this is like you can, people can invest $60,000 and start up a restaurant. You can do that. Starting up Graflex Parts was done with no startup funds. I am not a rich man. I did not have money for my parents or any of this fund. It's something where I've scraped it by to force us to work for the past few years. And that's where a lot of people, especially the millennial generation of jobs don't exist, your education. My brother specifically is college educated. He has a very nice degree. He's like a technical writer. He's full-time sewing bike bags now. And he loves it. He works like 35 hours a week. It's technically full-time, but he sews bike bags. He's like one of like 3 people in the sewing shop. And it's that hands-on manufacturing. But part of what this gets into is that you have it's lost knowledge, especially when you have the one guy at the foundry who the whole foundry has to stop when he goes to sleep because there are no replacements in there, especially like when you could go to school for camera repair 30 years ago, you really can't anymore. And you see this spawn up in how many industries. Like I'm involved in how many Facebook groups, and a lot of them end up like I run a lathe that's from the 1950s. There are collector groups around these lathes that are awesome, just like any other camera collector group. And same with that, I'm in manual machining groups on Facebook too, which are fantastic resources. And what you see are there's constantly old timers coming up like, hey, I've got a job in whatever state. Is anyone here a machinist that wants to move and get that job? And the problem is because they have all these kids that are going for CNC machining who can't turn single point threads on a manual lathe. Like they know how to run the computer coding. They know how to do everything by the book, like with formulas. But when it comes to the actual hands-on nitty gritty, like feeling that's behind a lot of this manufacturing, just intuition, I guess you can call it. That's the lost knowledge that is like being strived for. And with what I'm doing,
it's hard to teach. Hard to teach too, and to some degree, even when you have an instructor, you still have to teach yourself.
Oh yeah, and that's
yeah.
That's well, and that's like
your body has to learn it. It has to learn the material. Yeah.
Well, and that comes into like curtain making. I personally consider I tackled shutter curtain building from a point of view of this is something I can do by myself. I'm totally capable. I can get through it. And you beat your head over against a wall enough hours, and you do this and realize that it's something that you actually need to apprentice for. And again, this is one of those things in life where you can go to school for 4 years, et cetera, do this and that, or you can dedicate the exact same amount of time to cutting your teeth on doing something. And so what I did was I spent enough hours apprenticing for myself, I guess you could say, where I was making shutter curtains where I'd get done with it and look at it and be like, crap, I have to throw away $100 worth of curtain material and 20 hours of time and start over from scratch, invest another 20 hours on the same curtain, and like all the work over again. And when you do that enough times, the same way that this would have been done in an apprentice shop. If you would have been working in, like, say, the wood shop at Graflex and you're screwing up enough camera bodies, your boss is going to be pretty mad at you. Like whoever's managing you is not going to be super happy, and you're going to learn pretty quick like how to do something without screwing it up. And it comes into lathe tooling too. This week I was making these little tiny bushings for speed graphics, and I have a set of 8 that are perfect. I also have a set of 20 that are all just dimensionally wrong. And I'm sitting there indicating this, and it's not that I'm being negligent necessarily. It's just the motions and learning the process. And I think that speaks to a lot of prototyping too, is it's this constant, you're always going to be learning, and I am always learning. Like I'm not a master machinist, a master hammer craftsman. Like I'm really good at what I do. I acknowledge this, but like I'm always going to continue learning. And I think you put yourself at a what is that? At a loss if you don't consider yourself to be trying to learn and trying to get better. So I don't know. Everyone needs room to grow.
All right, so Ethan just asked me to lay out a logical plan that was going to take me 7 years into the future, and that's sort of completely impossible thing for me to do.
Well, maybe we can start 5 months in the past.
Yeah, so the way I tend to work is that I follow a lead, and it suggests 10 more leads, and that suggests 10 more, and I end up in the middle of a crazy spider web with goals in every possible direction. So I don't end up with a linear plot, but I've come from two basic starting points: the background in the history of science, and then a lifetime as a craftsperson and an artist. And these things are actually not different at all. People always like to say they're different, but they're not. They're all a matter of experimentation. It's always about asking questions, trying things, finding solutions that suggest more questions, and it never stops. And both fields are really the same in that respect. And photography is a nice kind of bringing together of those things. But for me, I really love the image making part. I like working on cameras, but I like actually taking photographs even more. So where I start always is with, very often with the desire to use a particular lens. And lenses are kind of an obsession, and I can't either afford nor do I have the desire to own all the many different kinds of cameras that you can put lenses on. So what I'm always looking for is a simple camera that appeals to me, and press cameras in particular do. I like the Mamiya press rangefinders that you mentioned. I've got the old G model, which comes with a Graflex back on it, or Graflock back on it, and also has the rear movements as well. So it's kind of got all the features in one camera. But what happened to me was I've been shooting with old large format and old large format lenses in order to use press cameras. But I suddenly realized that if I could get modern system lenses onto a speed graphic, then I would have all these other options of lenses from the 60s, which I love. I love they're starting to get advanced coatings and more advanced designs, but they're still old fashioned. They still have character, and they're cheap, especially from, you know, Russian manufacturers and Ukrainian manufacturers. So I just kind of boldly decided to saw this baby speed graphic in half. And in the process of dissecting it, I discovered that if I didn't cut through any of the structural parts, I could get to exactly the right flange focal distance for a Mamiya 645, which was good news for me because I have some Mamiya 645 lenses. And now that I'm experimenting with it, I've discovered that most of the lenses I want to use can just go right on a Mamiya 645 adapter. So I don't need to keep building different fronts for this camera. I'm able to use a lot of these lenses are designed for 6x6, and there's plenty of space for those lenses to project onto a 6x9 film back, which isn't really 6x9. They're usually 6x8. So I've got a Graflock back camera that I can put most system lenses on for medium format.
And for those of you who are listening along as, excuse me, as you're driving, go to Nick's Flickr page where he's simply Nick Lyle, and you'll be able to see this. I believe that, in fact, as we record this, the current one, the current picture is one of these.
A lot of things I really like about this camera are that it's a ground glass camera, so I'm seeing through the lens. But with these newer lenses, they're f2.8 lenses for the most part. So this little silly Graflex pop-out shade is plenty. You can focus easily just by holding it up, pointing, turning the helical, and then slap in some film and shoot. So it's very easy to use, and stop down, of course, because, you know, at 2.8 you're going to have a narrow depth of field. But
and it helps if you put turn the focus peaking on that Graflex body.
No, that's spelled differently. It's Peeking. Okay.
Yeah, there we go.
but I'm finding that it's really fun to use, and this is kind of how I think, is that I want to develop this farther. I want to make a version of this camera that's lighter and simpler, that has a focal plane shutter and some sort of system lens mount. And I'm very happy so far just basing everything on Mamiya 645, since, you know, you can get every kind of adapter imaginable for that format. And in the film backs, there's a few little limitations I want to overcome. So one of the limitations is that the standard Graflock back takes the Graflex style clip-on ground glass, and that's wonderful, except that the very best roll film backs won't fit on it. The newer, the Pro SD RB67 backs are fantastic, beautifully made things, and you can get things like 645 and, you know, all the different sizes. But the little clip hooks on the Graflex back that take the ground glass get in the way, and you can't mount it. The early RB67 backs go on just fine. The sort of hinky old Graflex roll film backs fit on okay, but I really want to be able to get the newer ones on. And then a rotating back would be nice, because this camera is very good to use on a tripod when you're trying to do narrow depth of field, precise stuff. So not having to tip the camera on its side would be an advantage. So there are all these little, it's like there are all these little features that need to be brought together to get the perfect version of this camera.
But you don't need the Pro SD back, because the whole point of the Pro SD back was that it had that double exposure interlock.
Yeah, but they're also just better made than the earlier ones.
They're really beautiful.
But they're way more expensive. And I understand if you already have a stock of them, you want to use them. But you're not using you're not really taking advantage of the features of those Pro SD things, right?
I mean, other than the not jamming and holding film flat features, the no wiggly advanced lever feature.
Aren't we fancy, Ethan? Oh my!
You know, if you're going to spend 5 months building a camera, what's another $50 on the back?
So the point I'm trying to make is that there are all these little niggling details that over time I'd like to solve, and there are different ways to solve it. And I still like using lenses with a leaf shutter. So I've got another camera going for that, which solves another disadvantage. So this is a Shenhao sliding back, beautifully made out of brass and wood, and it has a revolving film back on it. So you can go from landscape to portrait mode, and then you can just slide the ground glass over back and forth.
I want to point out that Nick plans to use this thing as a handheld camera.
Yes.
No, I don't really plan to use this as a handheld camera, but I plan to make an extremely lightweight camera that I can use on a lightweight tripod, because I like to carry this stuff up into the mountains and back into the woods.
Hey, Nick, you mentioned lightweight, but I wonder if it's just lightweight or physical size or ergonomics.
Well, physical size is part of it. So
you're going after?
Right. So part of the point of the sliding back. Now, I understand why Graham likes single lens reflexes, and probably I'll build one of those too at some point.
Oh.
But then you get into trouble with the big mirror, and the big mirror makes it hard to use wide angle lenses, and I love wide angle lenses. So sliding back makes it a fairly quick to focus and shoot version of these cameras that can have an extremely shallow flange back distance, and that's useful. As you know, with system with nons, you're limited. You need to get quite close to the film, and the mirror is hard to deal with for that. So there are mechanical solutions. There's many different ways to do it, but I also like simplicity, and a sliding back is extremely simple and quick. And the reason why should it be quick? You know, why does it matter? This is supposed to be the good kind of slow photography and all that stuff. But I really like, I find myself getting set up in conditions where the light is constantly changing and fluctuating, and where things are in motion, and I need to focus and then get ready and shoot fairly quickly, you know, in these little lulls between the wind and that sort of thing. So it's not the only kind of camera, but it's one other type that I want to be able to use. So for me, I'm always pursuing how to make really impractical cameras more practical. That's kind of what I'm after. and because I don't know, I like working with them, and I always find fault, and then I want to improve it. I want to make it do things more my way. And it's much easier to do that with this sort of carpenter's approach, where you can take pieces apart and screw them together, than it is to go out and buy a million different cameras and, you know, and try and keep them all running and that whole thing.
Well, and what's the flange distance that you ended up with on that camera again? Like, what's the shortest focal length?
Well, that one it's right around 60. I don't remember exactly, but
so
60, and you could go shorter by quite a bit, but it would require cutting into a brass support that holds the back of the camera on, which would then need to be replaced. Right, and Graham sent me another baby that I can play with. It's an older one, but it's worth a try.
So one of the nice parts of this actually is that what you've already done is that you shorten the flange distance farther than the camera can natively go. Because I think most speed graphics, they end up at, it's like 65 or 67 millimeter like minimum flange distance.
Right,
and
with the drop bed.
That's longer than even it's shorter on the Graflex, the slotted holder style, but the newer, like with the Graflock back, you have an extra umpteenth amount of space there.
Right.
Have you ever heard of or seen Graflex made 2 batches of like 500 of these? They did a 4x5 speed graphic that is a 3x4 rotation, and then they did a 3x4 Graflex speed graphic that is a 2x3 rotation.
No, I haven't. I do have a really nice 3x4 speed graphic, a pacemaker that is in great condition, and the shutter is great and everything. And what I have on it now is a 4x5 back.
Oh yeah,
that was designed to allow you to shoot 4x5 sheet film on the 3x4 camera and just throw away the the unexposed part. And then that's really wonderful. But when I started putting system lenses on it, I discovered that this back, if you put a roll film back on it, it's not centered on the lens, and so you lose the image circle, and a lot of combinations don't work. So what I need to do on this one is put on a 3x4 back that's centered on the lens. Not a 3x4, a 2x3 back that's centered on the lens. So that's the trick I need to solve with this one, and that's one of my next projects because I love using this camera. It's much smaller and lighter than the 4x5, but it still has a really long bellows throw, so it can take a really wide range of lenses, and it can retract pretty far back too. So I can shoot a lot of system lenses on this camera as well. And I've done it, but the problem is I can't use the full image circle.
Nick, did the original back not fit roll film backs?
Yeah, 3x4 cameras. The only roll film backs you can get are really crappy old ones. And the old Graflex ones that are knob wind are not really worth working with because the film is so unflat. But
yeah,
and you can get pretty decent ones for 2x3 backs, and you can use RB67 and really nice ones on 2x3 backs. So the secret is I just need to get a 2x3 back on here and get it as close to the shutter as I can, so that.
Well, and part of that is it's a common question of people are like, why is 3x4 stuff so uncommon? Why does it cost so much money to find the couple holders that exist? There were like a third as many 3x4 cameras made as any other 2x3 or 4x5. By the time that 3x4 speed graphics kind of existed, and actually even more to the point, 3x4 Graflock is a weird, like ugly cousin of the whole system. Graflex actually did not want to make 3x4 Graflock when they were making 4x5 Graflock. It was only until they got enough questions for it because they didn't want to make holders. They got enough questions for it, so they made a 3x4 Graflock, which you will never see one. They only made a few hundred of them, but it's essentially like a slotted style back without the slot, and you just shove the holder in against felt, and they all ended up having to come back for warranty service within 6 months. And in those 6 months, Graflex retooled and made 3x4 Graflock, but they just never wanted to make the system.
Right. This is a 3x4 Graflock camera, and I have the perfect back for it.
It's because 3x4 started to die by World War II, and everything was like, well, either do 4x5 or do way smaller. And then after World War II, people were like, well, 3x4 is still a press format. Let's use it again. And Graflex is like, we don't want to do it, but we'll do it.
Right.
What I was going to show though, quick, is this is the back of a Graflex Series C. And so this is a 3x4, but the same style. You have a button on the side of the camera that pushes in, and that releases a latch for the rotation ring of the camera, and that lets the back rotate a full 360 degrees. But it's that same setup where it's a stamped metal flange on the back of the camera, where Graflex for the 3x4, and this is all you would essentially have to do is, if this thing existed, would be a perfect stamped, or I guess at this point 3D printer could work too. You could probably harvest most of the components out of a 3x4 camera, and then you just size it down to a 2x3.
That's what I'm basically looking at. Although this is not a rotating back. This one's not a rotating back. I thought of putting an RB67 rotating back on it, which would be fairly straightforward. Yes?
My issue dealing with parts that have been stamped, and I'm sure, Graham, to some extent, you have tried to mill something that has been stamped because you don't have, a 12-foot tall, 20,000-pound stamping press with, hydraulic pumps and such. And you've found that it's very hard to mill something that is as thin as a original, stamped thin stock. And you probably have milled like 90% of a few parts and then just ate the thing as there's no connection to the chuck.
Yes.
But in 3D printing, like I built a Hasselblad hood, that fits into that stamped, curled, place where you fit the hood, and it worked great. It held my cell phone, and I could take like a digital picture and have a viewfinder and then shoot Polaroids or film on the back. But I was dealing with interfacing with, and this is why I designed cameras from scratch where all the tolerances are made for 3D printing. Because I was dealing with, I had to have less than a millimeter shim to slide into the top of a Hasselblad, and I could make it, but it would fall apart every you know, 2 rolls of film, and I wonder, you know, how you sort of deal with that when I mean, I know that I could not make 3D printed stuff that would be robust at those tolerances. I know I could make it, but it'd just be gossamer.
Well, that's why part of why I really like working with metal and machining itself is it gets into one of those things of you don't need to change your process or change your tools more than you change what you're understanding you can control. So, which is like this camera here has technically a stamped metal back that I fabricated myself. The whole thing I CNC'd. Actually, this cute little one. This is a Thornton Pickard 3x4 SLR. It's got some funky stuff going on to it. I have the hood extended with stamped aluminum, and then but on the back of the camera, I've engineered this little brass switch pushes in, and that unlocks the rotation wheel. And this is technically
that's the
weird
smoothest I've ever seen anything like that move, by the way.
Well, and,
like
and
Rubik's Cube.
So part of it is when I almost fell off my chair. Especially when it comes to machining. When I pick a stock to work from, like when you're working with PLA or 3D printing, you're getting your 1.75 millimeter filament, but you still need to go in and mic out your filament to make sure that it's actually 1.73, like you're over under extruding. And so that's like the whole, it's like black magic where there's just these rogue things that can go on, like what is happening to your heat, your extrusion, what's your environment like. When it comes to working with metal, and especially sheet metal, which is why I really like sheet metal for backs like that, is sheet metal comes out of the mill at a specific thickness with a specific machine tolerance.
Yeah. And
all you have to do is cut, bend it, make sure that everything's right. And technically your distances for raising any flange distance is perfect. And then when it comes to like when I'm working on a lathe, I work usually out of the exact same stock outer diameter that I need for my end part. Where I don't really have to do much work to get it where it is. And by design, it has that precision built into it, you know? And with 3D printing, you can do all that effort and you can watch your tolerances and sit and accept for it and count for it all. But especially when you're running like a CNC with metal, it's a lot more of an autopilot but then again too, this is a thing that people will look at something like a lathe. Like I post stuff all the time on my Instagram story of lathe work because you spend a lot of hours standing at it making chips. And something that's not always conveyed is machining has very similar like constraints where you have tool deflection where like even on like a CNC or mill, your tool maybe by a couple mils is just tweaking off to the side or with a lathe. I work a lot with brass and I work a lot with form tools. So I'm pressing a strong tool into very skinny brass, and that brass is bending out of the way. Yeah, it turns into a noodle at 1,000 RPM.
Right.
Which
and whatever inconsistency you may have in that material is going to be fighting with the tool, and you get a dance.
Well, but
I've kind of gotten into I use more of a carpentry approach for machining, but what I'm working on now with aluminum, because I don't have a lot of tools, is I'll make crude cuts with simple tools and then take something like a router table and make the precise final cut. And in that you can build up pretty accurate stuff that way. And it's, trial and error works fine. The material's cheap, it's soft, it's easy to cut. I go with a little thick, the thing with aluminum is it's soft so you make it a little thicker, but it's a lot lighter. So, it's a trade-off. What really impresses me about Graflexes in the pacemaker ones, my favorites, is how much stainless steel they put into them. Stainless steel is a little harder to work with in that kind of a direct, hands-on way, but it's something I want to do more of. I'm definitely going to build an all stainless steel camera for underwater photography pretty soon.
Oh boy,
this kind of turns into a on that whole thing of Graflex working with stainless steel. You also see, initially I started working with brass and other metals back in 1910, but what you're also watching there is the company is manufacturing cameras on the front end of things, but William Fulmer, the brainchild behind the Graflex and all, well, that's another topic, but behind all the manufacturing processes they did. When you go and look at William Fulmer's patents, he has the patents for the cameras, but he also has patents for his own tooling. there's an entire machine that he patented in, I think, 1917 that cuts the it's the gear track on the bottom of speed graphic rails, the focusing rails. It's what's actually driving it. And he obviously fed up with how things worked, committed the time to patenting his own machine that was dedicated to just that. And so you have like, yeah, of course they ended up working with stainless because that's where they were and that's what the industry was calling for.
And those are beautiful. Those are beautiful tracks too. Yeah. So a similar thing. So it gets into materials. So I have an old one of my power hammers is an old mechanical hammer, something called a Little Giant. It strikes with a 15-pound weight. A 50-pound weight onto an anvil. But the way it operates through is this very weird, sloppy centrifugal force system where you're bouncing the hammer against a spring, and it at different speeds, it has different harmonics, and it's very hard to control. And it's a very simple guide where the way they built it, it was cast iron on cast iron. And what happens is if you let it get out of adjustment, which you always did, then it would start to oscillate in the tracks and it would wear them into a curve and it would quickly go completely downhill. And what I had to do with this tool was have somebody machine the tracks back a solid 1/4 inch straight again, and then bolt on a piece of brass that would be now the bearing surface, and then allow that to be adjusted very subtly by shims. And that's worked for 20 years with no problem, because the part that was wearing all the time is a brand new cast iron part, and the part that was causing the trouble now is a much softer part that won't wear the part that was in trouble. Essentially, it's like you need to balance the material so one isn't mistreating the other.
Oh, entirely.
Yeah, and that should have been how the thing was designed in the first place. But it was possible to retrofit it and solve the problem.
You see that in other camera manufacturing too, and it's things that I deal with some of the things I'll replace. And you lose it when you come from a world of like automation and like 3D printing things, and then you look at the alternative, which is, I can pay a machine shop to do this. Why would I make it out of aluminum when I could make it out of steel? And it's like, you're making it out of aluminum because it's sacrificial. And there's a lot of parts, even with inside of cameras, and you see it more with machine tools. A lot of my lathe is made out of Zamek, like a zinc aluminum alloy that was really, which you guys probably know about, but it really popular in the 50s and 60s for manufacturing because it was a soft enough but very hard aluminum. And most of the stuff on the lathe is made out of that, and you really can't make it again. So instead of people will break something and be like, I'll mill this out of steel now. And it's like, don't make it out of steel because you're going to break even more expensive parts on your machine.
Yeah, so the Babbitt bearings on this old hammer have never been adjusted, and they are just fine. And that's a bearing which you make. The design of the machine is such that you carefully align your shaft inside of a hollow kind of a cup, and then you pour a molten alloy called Babbitt, which is sort of a fancy pewter kind of material, into that mold, and it perfectly fits itself to the part. And then they design in a way that you can shim it as it wears. You can shim it a little bit. That thing's lasted forever, and there's a wooden clutch that drives this whole machine. It's a piece of apple that, again, I have never even adjusted. And it takes the full force constantly. It's always slipping. It's designed to be always slipping. It's a big cone-shaped piece of wood that, again, has never even needed a shim in it. It's amazing. So it's getting those materials right. The way they interact is a big deal. And then people used to pay a lot of attention to that. Now it's kind of, well, how cheap can I make it?
Oh yeah. Well, but part of that too is replacement cost. When it comes to something of, especially, I think in the world of cameras, it's much easier to just readily break something by dropping it. And at that point, cheap replacement parts are really the bread and butter of it. But it also stems from, look at like the drop hammer. How many years of manufacturing and industry went into designing everything that went around that? Lathes have existed for hundreds of years now, and that's been slowly refining itself. Personally, I'm really enthused by like antique gun manufacturing, because you have precision life or death kinds of instruments where like the person testing it could very well kill themselves on the object, but they're somehow trusting their tools, which are at this point hand files even, So
yeah, but the thing about the hammers is that they're designed to beat on themselves hundreds of times a minute, with a huge hammer, and that's just a bad a bad situation in the start, to start with. So it takes it to an extreme. But the other end of this we've talked about maybe before is the development of a really accurate clock for ocean navigation. There's a great book about that, and that was all 100% in the end about material choices. It was, how can you make something that's basically self-repairing under really adverse circumstances?
Well, some of the actually a common issue I deal with in Thornton reflex cameras is part of the mirror linkage is a big chunk of brass, and after the camera's been fired, especially when these are cameras that sit on a shelf most of the time, when the family's kept it because it used to be old great grandpa's camera. It sits on a shelf, it doesn't actually get fired, but all of the things that can move get moved all the time. And so you end up with cameras that the mirror linkage can't actually flip the mirror up anymore because it's worn itself down so far because it was made out of brass pressing against stainless steel, which that was also an issue that I deal with in some of these cameras is I think it was the idea that these are high-end materials and not necessarily the longevity of the materials themselves, because I've been inside enough of these Thorntons where you have a stainless steel screw holding in a brass plate and the whole thing has rusted itself together and you're never going to get it apart.
Yep.
And even that's with the Graflexes on the SLRs, there's a little linch pin that's driven through the mirror shaft and that holds the whole thing together. That linch pin is steel and it's driven into brass. And so the hardest part of this is if you ever can't get that pin out, what you have to do is drill through the pin, but the pin is significantly harder metal than what you're trying. So you have to drill, which I have a couple pictures of this actually, of a steel pin with a hole drilled through it, and you manage to not touch the brass around it. That's something where you spend 2 hours drilling a pin out.
And then maybe reverse tap that hole, and then you can spin it out.
Yeah, no, so, and I've had, what was that?
Okay, before we go to, I'm going to take us on a different tangent, right? Okay. So, I mean, you have the advantage of 190, 50 years of these cameras in use, looking at them as sort of a repairman and a machinist, and you were able to replace or even improve some material choices, or have access to things like, in 1900s, it was even harder than it is now to mill stainless steel, which I hate doing. I try and stick to aluminum every time I can. And if it's for a professional job and it's stainless, I just send it to a fab. But so as you replace and improve, and we've talked about this a little bit, I think probably where this is heading is eventually you've replaced and improved almost every part of some camera. And maybe Graflex Parts will be one day, new Graflex Incorporated, or, I mean, not that name, right? But Graham, are you thinking about building cameras from scratch or nearly from scratch one day? I think you and Nick are headed in the same direction from two different sides.
I've always wanted to make cameras. It was a pipe dream years back where it was like, oh, I can 3D print this, I can 3D print that. I might have access to these things. And it was always like one of those wishes of, if only I had a mill, if only I had a lathe that could do these things. And honestly, I ended up getting an art grant this last year locally that supplied the funds for the milling machine. And then on my own, because you have that stuff, you invest more. But my long goal now is, not that it's something I necessarily want to right now think of for a profit item at all, but it's personally, I have, after I've been inside enough SLRs specifically, there's a lot of these mechanical things that I don't like. Like there's, when you have 5 different camera manufacturers that all existed in Europe at the same time, they were all fighting with each other trying to do different patents. And what you get is one camera that has an awesome mirror system in it that works really well, and then another camera that has a great shutter system but a terrible mirror system. And they could never put these together because they were all competing until the 1930s. And so kind of one of my long running goals now is I want to make kind of the end all be all of what I'm the most picky about for parts in a camera, which is much, I mean, that seems to be where you're going, Nick, with this whole thing, is that you see what exists on a speed graphic is its thing. It was intended to be a kit that served one purpose. but you're seeing its potential to be a slightly more refined kit towards a different circumstance, which honestly, Graflex probably was never going to consider trying to put on a lens that has a focusing helicoid included in it. You know, they were never gonna try and compete on that level with anybody else.
No, and it probably didn't make sense at the time because you know what beat Graflex was the Rolleiflex, and that was quickly eaten by Nikon. But really, what was going on was that the printing technology was changing. I mean, what kept Graflex alive? My dad, first newspaper job, he used a Crown Graphic, which I still have and still works great.
That's awesome.
But
that's good.
The whole point of that big negative was that you could contact print it. You could shoot one shot, you could rush back, somebody could dip it in a tank and develop it, and you could lay it, and you could make your, you know, it could go to press within literally minutes, which
entirely.
Yeah, and that was because they were using a fairly primitive darkroom and printing processes. Then it really paid to have this big negative. As soon as that wasn't necessary anymore, then then that all went out the window.
This brings up a really good point. We're in this very, and all of you obviously notice this. I mean, like Ethan, like especially with camera dactyl, like we're in a photographic renaissance right now of sorts, where these analog or alternative processes are like becoming really popular again. And what we're specifically seeing with like the Graflex community and these modification communities is there are all these desires that did exist in the 1950s, like wanting a speed graphic that has rotation on it. Everybody has always wanted that since the 1930s. The box literally could not make a vertical image until they redecided in the 1960s when they were rebranding and the whole company changed over. Let's make a camera that can do rotation, because that was being called for again. But especially things like a very short focal distance or SLRs as a whole, like large format SLRs effectively died by the 1950s because the market wasn't there anymore. And now we're at this point where we get a lot of like fine art photographers and other press photographers who are still trying to use these formats because they see the legitimacy in the tools they need. But it's now these manufacturing processes just don't exist anymore. So, I mean, the whole thing, like I would want Graflex parts to become Graflex cameras again, but I'm not trying to at all like sully the name of Graflex. It's we're in this time where, I mean, the same way that Packard Shutter Company still exists, it's they're running the exact same patents and everything, but it's a newfound market for all of this, and not even a market, just more a community around all of these things, you know.
And some new use cases, which is why I'm sawing them up and changing them around, because I want to do different things with them, but I still like the basic universal starting point very much. And
there's enough of those around. You know, you don't have to feel bad about cutting one of those up because there were thousands made at this point, and we're not running out yet.
So it's a moving target. So the first thing I thought of with this 3x4 was go put a 2x3 holder on it, because they're smaller and lighter. The roll film holders are smaller and lighter. Now I'm hesitating and thinking about sticking with 4x5 and adapting it, because I have big 4x5 roll film holders as well, because there's this instant film 4x5 back.
Yeah.
And that's really appealing. You know, the Instax wide back would be perfect on the 3x4 camera. Like that would be an amazing combination. And so, you know, I'd like to figure that. I think I'm going to go that way actually, because it's still a pretty big camera. I'm not going to handhold it. It's going to be a tripod camera. But there's all these wonderful side effects of having these long bellows. It's basically an instant macro. You know, you put any lens you put on here, you can zoom way out and, you know, and do close-up work. And there's all this great stuff that you get with bellows. So I'm going to keep that intact and just try and adapt roll film to it.
And you've also, I mean, I think a big part of this too is that you've realized, which is how often that I get a question of, oh, like what SLR should I shoot? Like what Graflex, what this and that. And the thing is, you've realized the exact tools that you need. And part of that is that you don't need to have a rangefinder included in the system. Like, so which gives you that ability to just like, okay, yeah, I need macros bellows, and like screw the rangefinder, just rack them all the way out like they can do.
Yep. Yeah. And also if you're using system lenses on it, which I am doing, the thing with the system lenses, like this is I've got a Bronica S mounted on a Nikon, but I also mounted on the 3x4 camera. All you have to do is mark your infinity spot, rack the bellows out, and then you can use the helical, which is super handy because it has a scale for scale focusing. And instead of having to, with a Graflex, you have to screw a little plate in just the right place, and you got to change it. You got to sit down with a jeweler's loop and change stuff when you change lenses. But if you put a system lens on the Graflex, you just need a mark on the rack, and you can zoom out, and then you immediately have scale focusing as an option. So that's really handy.
I think it's worth noting that, especially it's like a Graflex, a speed graphic with like a CalArt rangefinder on the side of it can be calibrated to obscenely shallow depth of field. Like in factory, you can calibrate CalArt rangefinder to be far more accurate than the manufacturer ever intended it to be. And that's, I mean, that there's something. If you're going to, it's knowing your limitations, knowing the limitations of the tools you're using too with the camera, of knowing like how refined it can be. And so when you have to go in and set those infinity stops, when you're really trying to push f2 audible lens or f2.3 something, that also the fact that you use an f2.8 lens that's a system lens that's not a $400 Buell or something like that. Exactly. Trying to get that shallow depth of field, and then also hoping that it's all agreeing with your focal plane too at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, this is a Soviet, or no, it's a Ukrainian lens, beautifully made, $50, and it's an incredible.
Yeah, optic, exactly.
You know, it's and it has all those advantages of being able to. I like being able to scale focus. That's how I hand hold. I don't mess around with, trying to focus through the ground glass. If I'm going to use the camera handheld, I'm just going to stop down and guesstimate the distance, which I'm pretty good at after being 30 years of fabrication and carpentry. I'm pretty good at judging distances. And if you stop down enough, it's super easy, especially with the wider lenses. There's just no trouble in it at all. It's less fuss, and then you don't have to think about anything except the framing and timing, which is a huge advantage. I find even with SLRs, the stupid freaking prism in the middle is a terrible distraction, and you're always worrying about it, and you don't need to. You just stop down a little. You can forget about that and think about your photography. Anyway.
Well, that's why, I mean, part of why I like, when I shoot a graphic, I like a view camera. It's going to be on a tripod. I'm going to be focusing through the ground glass, because I'm not the type of person who wants to dedicate all the time to operating a rangefinder just so I can off the camera and have it be off again. But part of what I love with like the big, large format SLRs is that you still get that view camera looking down a huge, huge viewfinder without any distractions going on in it.
Yeah.
But but still, it's, when you're shooting a camera like that, there are some people that do awesome action photography with them. Like the guy who was doing the F1 racing photography. But
yep.
Still, I mean, when you're sitting there having to adjust dimensions, adjust the shutter curtain, and then realize that reader for a different scene, crap, I need to be on a completely different aperture, read on the whole thing, and also trying not to burn frames at the same time. Like, oh, did I remember the dark slide? It's still a convoluted process and kind of slow. So it's
right, but you can get past all that. Now, when it comes to hand holding cameras, Ethan's cameras are really the way to go. Super lightweight, absolutely. You can use them with ground glass, but really, they're ideally used scale focus, and those things really are practical to handhold. I don't feel that way about my Graflex, even though my dad took amazing photographs hand holding a crown graphic. It's still, I don't relate that much to that way of using it.
That was the era where you were sent out with one film holder with 2 sheets of film, and if you couldn't get the entire story on the 2 sheets, you weren't worth the salt.
Well, he had
and you had to walk to school uphill in the snow both ways.
So one of his best stories was about having to take aerial photographs of a fire in Louisiana, and he got stuck in the passenger seat of a 2-seater Piper with no door on the passenger side, and the pilot went and banked as steep as he could over the scene, and my dad was holding his crown graphic with both hands, hanging by the seatbelt, pointing straight down towards the earth. and again, he had to change the film holder.
Yeah.
And the whole thing,
that gets into a whole
in a plane with going 60, 70, 80 miles an hour with the door open. And,
it's actually, you guys should maybe I'll post up sometime in the camera group. You see it a lot come through with Graflexes that were modified in the 1950s through the 1960s to become aerial cameras. Like when you could buy an aerial camera surplus, but they were still kind of spendy.
Right.
very fun to modify. There's some great cameras that come up that are, like, have these huge, like, aerial viewfinders attached off the front of them.
So my grandpa was a Navy photographer in World War II, which he really loved. I think it was the first time in his life he could eat everything he wanted. And he had a Bulova watch that they had used to modify to time making maps over, like, Norfolk, Virginia. He lived on an aircraft carrier and just made maps hanging out of planes, and told me some funny stories about standing on the control cables while popping out of the back of, I don't know what type of plane, but he said it went into a nosedive and the pilot used every expletive to get him off off the control lines. And yeah, I think there were a lot of people around World War II using Graflexes and aerial cameras and all sorts of things, just like making maps on 4-inch wide roll film. We did not have satellites.
Well, the crazy thing is Graflex history went through World War II. There was a whole thing of the cameras. I don't know explicitly how it goes, but the cameras were supposed to be kind of recycled back into the public, but also not recycled back into the public. And what you got were a lot of cameras that ended up into civilian hands that really shouldn't have been in civilian hands in the list. Because the thing was, Graflex didn't want to lose all of their business from all of these servicemen coming home, wanting the cameras of the shop, and are still. I mean, in 1945, these are very popular. But so you have like all war type graphics, a lot of them that had maybe seen military service that really shouldn't be around, and those are the same cameras that you see that, like, people are sneaking home or buying, like, when they really shouldn't have been, and those are the ones that also turn into aerial cameras. I don't know, it's really fascinating stuff to see modifications that were done when these cameras were still considered relevant. I mean, socially relevant to the actual professional photography going on. When they were expensive, and it was, you got to have some balls when you're going to cut up a camera back in 1950, you know.
Yeah, but that was still much more of an era of people who did that kind of thing on a routine basis. My grandfather, my father's father, was a test pilot in World War I and flew biplanes, and he was not necessarily trained as a mechanic, but he tore down and rebuilt the engine of every plane he flew, pretty much every time he flew it, because even the engines were experimental at that point, and you wanted to know for sure it was going to work. I have one of his manuals for Hispano-Suiza aeronautical engines, and when you read through it, it has beautiful copperplate illustrations, but when you read through it, you basically boils down to, this is how it works. You should change the oil a lot, and you're pretty much on your own. There's very little practical information in there, because they didn't really know what was going to happen when you fired one of these things up and, flew off into the air with it. It was just all in a big experiment.
Well, that's actually, it's even, every time someone finally gets a shutter tester behind one of their Graflexes, and they're like, my shutter can only do 1/500th of a second. It says 1/1000, but 1/1000's not there. We didn't have digital shutter testers in 1902 when the curtain system was designed, and the curtain system didn't change until the 1960s. Like, it was the same system. They were just, well, when you have, the first SLR ever made was for bird photography. When you have your average ISO film was like less than ISO 20, a 1/1000th of a second shutter speed is half impossible. Like, when are you ever going to need it? It's like, just go wide open.
This baby does 1/800th dependably. This is a nice shape. All the shutters are close enough to the advertised. I really like
speed graphics get really close.
I like the pacemaker system a lot, because it's just bone simple. You can actually read the number of the shutter speed right on it. And
also, they pared down the speeds.
Yeah.
So instead of an entire chart, which that's also one of the things that you see is it's Graflex not copping out that their product isn't accurate, but they start to get more real with the shutter speed arrangement. So instead of having 1/10 to 1/1000th by 1/10 of its, like, little increments, which really don't, especially today, when all these springs are so exhausted, those tension adjustments really don't do as much as they used to. But there's
my shutter speeds. There's the real speeds. And that's all I do.
No, but
okay. You were a little bit blurry on that.
Okay.
For those listening at home,
there we go.
Yeah.
So I have a piece of white tape with each of the real shutter speeds written on it, and I can tell that, you know, it's always a little slower than what it says on the camera.
And it looks like 44 and what? Read the numbers. I don't think we can.
So this camera has these shutter speeds: 24th of a second, a 40th, a 94th, a 200th, a 340th, and one 814th. And that may sound a little too accurate, but this thing's extremely consistent. And, you know, using an old style light meter, it's very easy to just move your finger along to where the real shutter speed is and read off the accurate aperture. And with the film I use, that's probably far more accurate than I need. But
the reasoning behind the reasoning behind the accuracy in, like, so speed graphics tutorials, you can get a speed graphic to accomplish 1/1000th of a second, but you end up losing the low end of speed. And part of it is consistent manufacturing. When they started to mass produce curtains at 2000 per batch, all of their apertures are identically sized. But when you get to like a camera like the older SLRs, you have, instead of the curtain moving mostly in a straight line from one roll down to the other roll with two little lighter, there's little rollers that support those and don't do anything in a pacemaker speed graphic and all other graphics. On the SLRs, you have the arrangement changes a lot, so you get more of a trapezoid shape, and that trapezoid starts to induce a lot of drag. And actually, if you watch an SLR shutter curtain fire in like slow motion, like high speed footage, you'll see without the back on, the curtain actually ejects itself out of the camera slightly. Wow. And it's contacting. Yeah, right. So there's all of this really specific geometry that goes into it, but what you get is SLRs just have too much drag going on. And then also, if you would actually get out a ruler and measure your 1/8 inch aperture on an SLR, usually you'll find it might be 1/8 inch in the corner, but in the center of it, it might be 1/4 inch. Right. So when right. That's your entire aperture, it's doubling the speed, you know.
Sure. So. And that it's doing it locally at the center of the frame as well. So that's a little odd.
So you'll get vignette and other weird things going on.
Well, I'm super happy with the pacemaker shutters. The two that I have, they're in good condition. They're consistent, which is the main thing. They're very useful shutter speeds. And I find that I don't think I'm going to want it, you know, unless it's a completely dead calm situation and I'm using bulb, I'm going to be using faster shutter speeds with this camera. It has a pretty violent shutter action, and very often I'm photographing things that the wind is blowing, and, you know, all of these things are going on that the fast shutter speeds are actually quite useful, and that tends to be what I use on them.
You should see how many questions I've gotten before asking, what's wrong with my focus? What's causing this blurriness? I'm getting a double image in it, and it's your camera's shaking. Yeah, it's on a tripod and it's shaking. Like, if you manage to hold the thing still enough, you're not going to get a double. But trying to shoot 1/30th of a second on a camera that's rocketing around the whole time. You know.
Yeah, and that's one reason I didn't even bother trying to rig a cable release on this Speed Baby. I use the built-in shutter button, and I just shoot fast enough that it's not a problem. And, you know, we have fast films and fast lenses on it, so what's the big deal? Yeah. It works fine.
I mean, and that's where, again, it's what's crazy is that's a camera system whose shutter was designed in 1902, and it lived until 1973. You know, like, it was still being produced to the bitter end. And that's the whole speed system being dated from 70 years prior. Well, in a totally different world, the world of slow film, when you couldn't get fast emulsions.
Right. Yeah, that's true. It's hard to imagine what they were doing with it, you know, with the high shutter speeds back then. Right. They did have faster lenses, but those were designed for ease of focusing. You weren't actually supposed to use them wide open, you know.
Yeah, well, and then also you end up with projection lenses that were trying to be fast just because of their whole nature of things, and that's a whole. Well, and even the world of single lens reflex cameras, they weren't considered professional press cameras until about the 1920s, because the first 20-30 years, the first SLR, the first large format SLR as we know it, not a camera obscura or a hinged mirror camera, with the actual traditional SLR. So the first SLR was built in 1898, and the guy who built it stole a few other people's patents. William Fulmer found the camera at I think it was at a trade show or something, or saw it being demonstrated, and he's like, I really like that. can I steal your idea? Stole the whole idea, made what we know as the Graflex, the true namesake. That came out in 1902. And the story goes that William Fulmer traded the first Graflex for that guy's camera, and now that camera sits in the George Eastman Museum.
Right.
And
those were cameras that were being bought by basically artists and portrait photographers. That's who was
it was bird photos
and birds.
You needed 1/1000th of a second to take photos of birds.
But also the single lens reflex, which is kind of an awkward contraption if you're a reporter. You know, it's
oh yeah.
Yeah.
And it's too much faffing about for your average press photographer.
There was also a whole school of cameras designed for theater photography, but those had to be quiet, and they had the early fast lenses were on those for taking pictures by gaslight in an opera house. Right.
Yep. Yeah, that too. What you look at the necessities for some of these things, and it seems very normal today that I want a fast shutter speed, I want fast lenses, I want fast this and that, but like back in 1910, why do I need this? I don't need a fast shutter speed. Like, this is absurd. Who would want that kind of a thing on this camera?
Yeah.
And it's like, why wouldn't you make this? You had the technology back then.
Speaking of absurd and why wouldn't you make it? Graham, we have heard a little bit about Nick's dream cameras and wacky ideas and just because things. If you were to build a camera right now, I don't want to give you, I don't want you to give away too many trade secrets or upcoming projects, but what would your dream camera kind of look like if you were building one for yourself?
It would probably be based on 4x5 format. So it would be essentially a 4x5 SLR. But there's a few different styles, and Graflex never really cared about this, but short mirror distances. Cute little Series B. But so there's I don't know if any of you are aware of the compact Graflex. They made them in 3x4 or 3x5 postcard format, and then also 5x7. And the idea was you were making contact prints off of the format. Those only used until I think the late 1930s. They weren't really terribly popular. They made a lot of them, and so those cameras, what you end up with is a very, very short mirror system that actually will collapse itself inside of the camera. So you can rack the bellows all the way back, and it is the 3x5, which if it was engineered properly, it would make a perfect 4x5 image. It does not, because the film gate's too small. But if Graflex had seen this back in 1920, which is kind of where my vibe's going with this, I don't want to make necessarily anything new. I want to do things in the iteration and inspiration of what these factories would have been doing if they had the needs that they have today. So the compact Graflex, the idea is instead of having a 3x4 Series D, which is the ubiquitous Graflex SLR that most people know, has the shortest flange distance of around 7 1/4 inches or something like that, which is pretty long for a lens, which is what Nick was saying. Like, you can't get a short lens on those cameras. As much as you want to, you can't.
Right.
But what they did with the compact Graflex is the idea was that you were taking like postcard photos. You're doing landscapes. You want wide angle. You're trying to get that atmosphere. And so you end up with a 3x5 compact Graflex will accommodate a lens of right over 5 inches. So that's a significantly shallower lens. When you look at other systems like the Kershaw or Marion Soho Reflex, Dalamer Reflex, Kershaw, they all were produced under the exact same Soho factory in London. Or the Kershaw patent. So this is a time when you were manufacturing, you didn't have a little shop like I have. You were renting a space in a much larger factory that produced and had the tooling accommodations for you. And like, you kind of had to be a pretty business savvy person to get your foot in the door there. So places like Kershaw, what their systems are is the entire mirror box swings backwards as the mirror is lifting up. And the idea is your lens can be much closer than the tip of the mirror actually is. And so your lens comes back into the camera, and the mirror is picking itself up and going around the back of the lens as it's lifting to the top.
So the Bronica S2 had exactly that mechanism in it, and the Bronica S2 has actually a lot of room behind their lenses, and somebody I know just recently was inspired to mount a Leica lens way down inside the barrel of one of these helicals because of that, and it worked fine. So that's actually a great idea, and I have a more of a crude approach to that in mind, which is just to use a small mirror. In other words, build your big Farmlight Matte camera, make a little dinky little mirror. And my idea was actually to make it sort of a periscope arrangement that you pull the whole thing straight up to clear the film path and drop it straight down to film.
Okay. Oh,
so
yeah.
You could make a super shallow camera and focus very accurately, and then you would frame with a viewfinder separately. And so it's kind of like a giant Barnack arrangement with a periscope for focusing. And I think that would be worth trying.
I was going to lift it. Oh, lens is too far in. This is the exact issue. Is this camera collapsed? What the mirrored all the way up because its native lens that's on it is too shallow. But
Graham, what camera are you holding up?
This is a 3x4 Thornton & Pickard with the hood removed. So this goes on. This is a project camera that I showed before with the rotating back. But what they did
so
is
it's a big SLR.
Huge, big SLR. I could show you here. We'll show you what a big SLR looks like.
This is one where you can it's like the old Ford.
It's not an SLR. This is an SLR.
That's not a knife. This is a knife. Yeah. So even like too big to get. Here, I'll stand up and back away from the camera so we can get a size comparison here. So the size of the top.
You can chop your head off and stick it in there and be room for somebody else.
I have
camera looked to be about 10 inches tall. The body of it about 10 inches.
That's about a little over a foot. I think it's about 12.5 inches tall.
And what size film? What size film?
Graham Burnett is actually 7.5 feet tall.
Yes.
No, that's 5x7 or whatever the iteration of English version of that is. I work in Imperial. I work in good old freedom units, you know. So you can't. To get back here, my ultimate idea with trying to design my own camera system, and this comes into when you're doing like most of the linkage I could manufacture out of what I already have, but you end up to the bitter end of things where it comes into gearing. Like cutting clock gears is not that's craftsmanship itself. Like you need to be kind of a tool maker on a level to be able to do that with some semblance of consistency. So there's like more hurdles I do need to get over to get to the point, which is I guess the 1 to 7 year kind of plan thing. But ultimately what I want is a kind of boutique SLR that is kind of subsized for what we have available. Something that can accommodate about a 5-inch lens, maybe a little shallower if I can make it happen. But then I also want the other option of long bellows extension, where I can, if I really feel like it, drop a door down, pull the bellows out up to 12 inches and fit on a long throw lens. Which is something that on the compact Graflexes and on the Kershaws, you can't do that. They only go out so far because they're meant to be so small and only accommodate small lenses. So it's kind of like that one little very specific camera to do a couple very specific operations.
So I'm gonna suggest strongly that you get this thing down below 85 millimeters if possible, or make a version that gets below 85 millimeters. It doesn't have to have anywhere near as big a piece of film on it, but then you start. Then you start to pull in all sorts of really cool system lenses as another option. So it's a different camera because they're not going to shoot on as big a piece of film.
But it's part of my idea with this too, and other things I like is the idea of scalability, that I could take a system and scale it down to a much smaller thing. I mean,
exactly.
Ultimately, I would love to have a 2x3 Graflex variant.
Mm-hmm.
That is my own manufacture. I mean, on even a 2x3 SLR Graflex, you still don't have that short flange distance. I think those are only about 5 inches too, 5 or 6 inches minimum flange.
So
which is
that's why I saw the Speed Graphic in half. That's exactly why I did it, and it pushed me in this other direction. But now I'm really getting excited about these lenses because a bunch of these cameras nobody can deal with them anymore. RB67 lenses are unmatched, and Pentax 6.7 lenses are unmatched in terms of optics. They're just fantastic, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper because people can't handle the cameras. So there are these amazing optics that are just looking for the right camera to use them on. So, Graham, before I run off to work, Graham, I did want to ask you to just give us, you've already started on it, but just a little more information about the basic Graflex shutter design. The ones especially that went in, I'm most interested in the ones that went into the pacemaker speed graphics. You already mentioned that the SLR lens cameras had a different geometry, but I'm going to be tinkering with some. So the two good pacemakers I have are fine. I just measure the shutter speeds and I work with them, and they're consistent. But I have a couple older springbacks, a 4x5 that I got basically as a parts camera, and one that Graham Young sent me that's a baby, and they have the old complex shutters with all those adjustments, and they're usable. Complex. They give me shutter speeds that work. And I just pick my favorite setup, like set it on D and just use that instead of trying to, fool around with it. But I am curious to know how much is involved in tuning them up or getting the springs to be a little tighter or whatever you can do to make them run better. Is it a mechanical process, an adjustment process, or is it pretty much a matter of replacing stuff?
It goes on a couple different levels of getting a curtain system to work again. It mostly comes into tuning. Especially when it's slow Graflex shutters, as the ambiguous term. Most of the time, it's that there's enough dirt and grease packed in every little corner of everything that it's just not working anymore. And that's why a lot of times people will just purge the system with oil, and usually you can get it working again. The real proper way is you pull everything apart, you disassemble. So on a speed graphic, you have there's a tension selector mechanism, and then an aperture selector mechanism, as I call them. Right. And you pull off the aperture selector and the tension plate. You pull it all off, which is disengaging them from the curtain's timing. So you have to reset the curtain's position when you put the whole thing back together. And you sit and pop that all apart, clean it all out with degreaser, re-grease it all, put it back together. There's bearing cups on the left side of the camera that you clean out and re-oil too. And then when you're resetting the camera, which this is also something that I've seen depicted in a manual from the 1960s, but this is something that if you were working on a Graflex, you just kind of understood how to tune these things. And there's a really finicky spot that Graflex curtains always bounce when they hit the bottom. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, if the curtain's not set right, the rib or the aperture will bounce back up and reopen the curtain and expose. So you'll end up with bird marks. And there's all this stuff where you're just playing with gear teeth positioning. But so it's like getting a distributor rotor arm back in the right place on your car, basically. and that being said, when you look at most, so you said the more complicated version, which is the anniversary or pre-anniversary speed graphics, the ones that have two different plates on the side, they've got the couple different winders. Right. On a pacemaker, you have that one complete panel with a shutter sync plug-in. They are technically the exact same system. When you pull the cover plates off, the escapement and gearing all technically works the same. You have a little plate that's moving up and down, letting up, and it's got a little pin that's stopping another gear from moving. Graflex systems are incredibly simple compared to every other focal plane shutter design. The most complicated part of the Graflex shutter design is that the curtain is so long and so precisely manufactured. Mm-hmm. That's how it all relies on, is that the curtain is exactly a certain thickness on every single point. This is why you can't just recoat a curtain, because you're going to double the thickness and it's going to jam it everywhere. Or what you get is, if you're using an incorrect thickness of curtain, the gearing literally will not line up anymore. So you can make an identical curtain out of a thinner material, but it's going to roll up way differently.
Sure. And it's like starting a roll film at the wrong place. It's the same problem. And this is when it gets into spacing and timing when it comes into film holders. This is why I think it's awesome anytime anyone develops like a 120 or 35 millimeter film advance system, is because there's how much gearing mechanics that go into the back end of that and all the design work. But with Graflex, so the Graflex shutter curtain design technically changed a bunch of times. The first curtain design that came out with the 1902 is mimicking Thornton Pickard's curtain design too. All these companies were kind of, it's a variable aperture curtain that has two different sides. So there's a top curtain and a bottom curtain, and depending on how you adjust the curtain aperture, it will lift it up to the top, and then it'll open the aperture up however. Or
if you're on a different system, it'll open it up at the bottom and then raise it all to the top. That's a dual curtain system. I mean, same with like how 35mm camera has an opening curtain and a following curtain. But this is just huge. They went through a couple different iterations of this until like 1907, 1908, when they eventually landed on what is like the stereo Graflex, which is something that few people have ever seen. But they decided on that long roll curtain design. I think it's once their stamping and manufacturing got to a point. And so once they set on, this is how our escapement's going to look. It's only going to be 3 gears inside this. The tension, I mean, so the heart of a Graflex system is the whole top is the brains of it. You've got a gear that sets all of it. And then the top is just a static roller that the curtain rolls down from. And the bottom roller has a big mainspring inside of it that provides the tension. And that tension is locked by the tension selector plate. And so I had this design down in probably 1915 and all the manufacturing. I think 1915 was like the latest patent date for that. This is why Graflexes went for. This is why in World War I, there was a government contract that supplied the U.S. Signal Corps with, I believe, 200 or 300 different Graflex 3As, and then also auto Graflex 4x5s. Really cool cameras to see. They're done up in brown leather, and they have a U.S. Signal Corps embossed on the side of them. Like absolutely loony. But once I think what you see is and you see this in like firearms design and manufacturing of government contract work, and you have many different suppliers who are all trying to bid for the same contract with the US government, and the government really cares about what's going to be reliable, what is your average guy not going to fuck up or not going to screw up relentlessly, and like what's going to be serviceable, what's going to survive combat. And so World War I think, was really that solidified that the Kirks, these cameras are like a true design. So in World War II, government orders a ton of speed graphics because it was a proven design that you really can't break them. And when you break a couple things, like you can replace the parts yourself, you can oil them. There's actually, I don't have it down here. But I have the military manual for the 4x5 speed graphic in 1945, and there's an entire sheet that's got all these little pinpoints of like oil this, oil this, oil this, and there's actually in the manual there's even the destruction instructions, so how to destroy your camera so it does not fall into enemy hands, and it's this verbose thing about smashing the flash and breaking every part of the camera so it can't be stolen. But
as if the Germans wanted a speed graphic, right?
Well, and as if they weren't already aware of them and didn't already have access to these cameras the past 50 years.
And we're grinding the lenses for them and all the rest of it. Yeah,
that too. No, and so I think that's one of the biggest indicators is when you see the military using something like that, because the military doesn't always use the nicest equipment or the best, or even the most bulletproof, but it's like what's actually what's reliable. And that's why you end up with Graflex cameras that can sit without a single drop of oil or service for 70 years. They get into hands today, someone buys them off eBay, throws a couple drops of oil on it, and it'll still work miraculously because the design was bulletproofed back in the 1930s.
So just to confirm something, I think you said, are you saying that essentially the primary difference between the old ones and the pacemaker is the user interface rather than the actual interior?
Yes.
And it's so in the newer ones, are similar adjustments available inside the camera, and they've just basically taken that out of the hands of the photographer?
They actually put more adjustments into the hands of the photographer in a weird way. So on say like the older style speed graphics that have the two different panels on them, to adjust tension on it, you do need to have a specific tool. There are instructions in old manuals of how to tool. It's a long process, but I'm trying to make tools that will work on these cameras, so you don't have to cobble things together with like a spanner wrench. But you need a couple specific tools. You need to know the tension process. But when you get to a pacemaker, once you pop that cover plate off, you do not go in. You can adjust the tension once you pop the cover plate off, and the cover plate doesn't affect anything.
Right.
When you're adjusting the tension in an anniversary, you're disassembling. You can catastrophically just lose tension if your hand slips. Okay. On a pacemaker,
right.
Once you pull it off on a pacemaker, there's a little scalloped like pinwheel flower kind of shaped thing. It's got 4 little scalloped sides to it, and it's got a set screw, and you just back the set screw out a little bit, and you turn the little square to a different scale, but you pull the set screw back in. And because of the system, you can't just accidentally lose tension. Like, you'd have to pull the whole thing apart physically, doing stupid stuff you shouldn't have been doing to actually like lose tension on those. And so there's also 2 springs in the bottom of a pacemaker. That's a whole other thing when it comes into their design. But it's the heart of it, though, did not change. I mean, and this is why the SLRs have completely different looking hardware. But once you actually pull these out and look on the back sides, speaking of which, I should have enough parts here. Because, you know, I just got a couple of, just a few of these around. So this is the heart of, and you will see this exact same design inside of the pacemakers. They just elongate the whole thing. They add in a couple different stops. There's some flash contacts and different things going on. And so this is what it looks like. Has your normal anniversary.
The inside looks like Picasso designed it.
Yeah. So
maybe
and this is why, and it's the exact same system in 1 second. All right. Don't knock everything over first. So your speed graphic with the escapement, this thing, you've got one big gear in the back that's moving around, and then there's this escapement that moves up and down, and it's locking at different points. It's stopping the curtain from just slipping. Then this is from 1940s speed graphic aperture selector component. Now this is off of a 1920s home portrait. So a big 5x7 large format SLR, and it is at the heart the exact same system inside. So
we might have to patch some
still side by side there.
I'm not getting the image.
Yeah, yeah.
That would be fun. We're going to have to talk again for a long time and pretty soon. I have to go to work now, so I'm really glad we met and we got this far. I can see I'm going to end up taking one of these cameras all the way apart pretty soon. So this is really very good for me. Thank you.
I am always available for tech support for the general public and everything. If you need help, I mean, some secrets I won't give away, but if you need to learn how to retension your camera, I'm always here for everybody.
That's fantastic. It's great to meet you. See you guys.
So we lost Nick to backhoe operation for the rest of the day, but I'm curious to see some of your. Obviously, we can't go through all of them because you've done so much, but some of your build process photos and kind of things that you've worked on. Graham Burnett, do you want to give us a little bit of a slideshow?
Yeah, I totally can. Let me screen share here. So what I'm going to start with is going to be. So it was a good few years back now. I did a full top to bottom restoration on a 5x7 Graflex home portrait. So big boy SLR. I couldn't find the one before photo I took before it, because when a gross camera, you don't really like a photo of a gross camera. It's like, I want this to look better. And so this was a that I did for somebody, which is you'll figure out pretty soon what certain parts of it were commissioned. Is my screen sharing right now?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So this photo is, I think, the first step of this process that I had. See a camera that's wrapped in wet paper towels and then saran wrap.
Generally not advisable to store your photographic equipment that way.
No. So all these cameras were covered with leather back in the 20s, and the saving grace of Graflex cameras that were covered in leather is they didn't use synthetic adhesives. They used hide glue, so glue derived from hide and gelatin and all that, which is water soluble. And so the best thing is with Graflex, if you do find yourself in a position where you need to remove the leather, this one leather was rotting off and had been like mouse chewed most of it, so it was completely unsalvageable. was very delicately moisten it. And so this wasn't sitting here for hours like this or overnight. This was a watched process. I was pulling the saran wrap back up, making sure the leather was releasing, because if the water leaches too far into the wood, you end up effectively destroying the wood. It'll start to crack in spots because the panels were specifically put together and also not meant to get wet.
So how long a time do you leave it like this?
This was, I think, like 20-30 minute rounds. And I was on it the whole time. And then the gross part is you have to get a SLR or like a putty knife and carefully, without damaging the wood too, because now you've got softened wet wood, you have to scrape off the hide glue by hand, which is just absolutely, and then you've got hide glue on your hands and there's rotting leather everywhere. So it's not a very pretty process.
Thanks. Makes you want to be a vegan. Hide glue.
I mean, it smells like other industrial things I've been around that I've learned to like, but you know, hide glue's got a stench. So this is this next photo here is parts removed from the camera. So I had pulled everything off of the camera because when you're removing leather, you can't have any hardware left. The alternative to this is once you remove that leather, you need to shim underneath all of the hardware, which I have photoed later. So this is just fret standard and some of the mirror box components, etc. And this is what the camera looks like when it's got the glue stripped off of it. And what you're seeing is it looks like it's stained and kind of wet, and that is the remnant glue, which all has to be painstakingly sanded off. This is the pile of hardware with the original Duco automotive gray paint that they used, which got really gross and was also rotting off. And so my process to go about is then brassing out the whole camera, which on automotive paint, you want to use paint stripper. The paint stripper really doesn't touch this 1930s automotive paint. So it ends up becoming a very painstaking hand sanding. And also when you're sanding all of this stuff, you're trying not to destroy the profiles of these sharp edges, these curves, because then it starts to look like someone's been molesting the camera pretty bad. And then once you end up pulling a camera apart and you pull all this stuff off, you get to sanding it, you start to find, and this is a very common thing to see. What I've got up right now is a big Jacobs clamp over the bottom of the camera, because the camera had obviously been dropped a few times. So
like the leather was holding some of the joints together.
Or covering it all up and covering up issues that you didn't see until you pull the camera apart and you realize the thing is barely hanging on. So the finger groove joints there were mostly separating and letting go. Big couple bumps. Re-glue it, clamp it, and the thing where you'll get into the middle of a project like, oh, I'll finish this up today, and you end up with it's like, I need to let glue sit and dry for 2 days before I can do anything again. And then finally, after all that, we got to the process of staining, which is, I think at this point, probably 35 hours work into the camera to get to this point. When you're sanding mahogany,
I thought you meant to finish it.
I'm not a worker by trade. Yeah. So, and this is also usually the part where personal build. It's a normal common thing that people want to make with camera, but once you'll start out, oh, this thing's great, like I can't wait. I've got the leather off of it, and then you into the nitty-gritty work of this mahogany is extremely fine grain. When I like using a 2 or 3 step stain process. I stain with a dark color, I sand a little bit, and I stain with a light color. And you kind of get a popping of the grains. This is something I learned because I've refinished some instruments before, violin and such, and it's a process you use to kind of pop really beautiful grain. But especially on mahogany, when you're using a dark stain like this, because I personally like darker woods when it comes to a camera like this, kind of make it look like a tackle box. You end up with the scratches are super visible once you start staining. So you'll go through all of this effort of work, and you'll get the stain on and realize that you have all of these scratches going cross grain in spots that they shouldn't be. And that's a big way to denote an amateur refinish job is you'll end up with some of the camera, there'll be like weird scratches in spots. So woodworking jobs are best left to somebody who could commit hours to it. Now what we're seeing here in this photo is very, very smooth mahogany. And this is part of what I love of that whoever picked the panels for this camera, like in the wood shop, was picking all the mahogany panels for it, picked gorgeous grain. Like this was never going to be seen by the public. And especially like on the top of it, what you're seeing here is the camera is laying on its back technically. And the top side would be the front where the lens is. And those are panels that are even covered up by hardware later on. And they're just gorgeous. And now what we're slowly getting into is the tongue oil process. This would be about, because I'm a fan of oil finishes. I don't like lacquers. I don't like urethanes. I don't like plasticky looking wood. I like oil finishes that kind of keep the texture and the grain of things. I think it's, especially when you consider that a lot of antiques that we have are refinished in oil finishes that last a very, very long time, and they only get more durable with time too. And you can continue applying finishes if it ever scratches. So tongue oil is a kind of like French oil. I mean, French oil is a totally different process, but that same painstaking, hand rubbed, you're going through this whole very delicate, it's not just spraying it with lacquer and letting it cure for a day. So the sheen and shininess that you're seeing in this photo is about, I think, 6 or 7 layers of tongue oil, which is 6 or 7 days of letting, like one layer per day, let it cure, and then do another layer the next day. Wow. And so this continues and continues until at the end of it. Also, if you these are old trays underneath stuff. Lunch trays work great to hold small parts, especially if you know where all the parts go in the end. So this camera slowly went through painstaking process, and that this is the brass out. I mean, when you're working on a camera like this, it could just kind of gravitate from small thing to small things. So you lose inspiration. But this camera ended up at around, I think, just over 20 layers of tongue oil on most of the wood. Which
how many days did that take?
That machine. That's so I mean, in the end, this camera consumed a little over 300 hours of work, which is like, it's a labor of love. Just the hardware's just sitting on here right now, just getting spectated.
Hey, real quick, Graham, can you make these photos like full screen? That'd be better on YouTube resolution. This process reminds me of what is that Japanese lacquering process that'll take like 75 years, but almost make something look like plastic, like plastic.
I mean, French oil is very much the same way, where you continue rubbing oil that's constantly evaporating until you have built up this obscene layer of all. And that's when you're working with like an oil finish like Danish oil or tongue oil, it's soaking into the wood. Mm-hmm. And then you're buffing it off until there's almost nothing left on the surface. And then you let that cure enough to a point where you can throw another coat on. That'll soak in and slightly soften the first coat. And you keep building up layer after layer after layer until you end up with a substantial coating. It takes at least 3 coats of
I use 2 coats of Danish oil on everything I laser cut just about, and then I'm done. You could use about another.
Yeah, and you know what? Yeah, and that's one of those things where you'll see the most difference that happens in an oil finish happens in probably the first 3 coats, where you see it go from bare wood to, wow, it's got some sheen. There's some more depth to the grain, like a little bit more luster going on in the wood. And then it takes about another 15 coats before you see the next step of things getting an actual, like a really fine. And so these are, so this photo is pretty disgusting. This is very grossly a long time ago. But when you end up, so getting back to the wood here, after you put that much time into it, you get a kind of depth to, if you see this, like it starts to actually get a near finish, but you get a near finish with the grain still. Here, this is the focus knob, which is the best thing about home portraits is they didn't use a knob. They used the wooden knobs like on the big studio cameras and studio tripods and like studio stands that Graflex was making. So you'll see the same knob on the big Century Studio camera stand. But they're all painted like Glass Factory. A little bit, I've got a some of this hardware, so this brass thing on the side of the camera, little nipple thing, this is the point where you start putting hardware on and realizing that it all needs to be shimmed to actually work, because the screws can't go in that far. The hardware doesn't tighten down because you just removed like 2 millimeters of leather off the entire camera. Now the fun part.
So what are you using to shim that?
Is the
More
that was
lacquer.
felt. I changed. Well, the lacquer goes. The finish only goes so far, but what I end up doing is you can use corkboard is a big one. I know some people use like acetal or like a Delrin sheet in black, really thin. I'm actually now where, being that I have the tools that I have in my shop, my goal definitely now is that I'll be CNCing actual like brass shims for all this stuff, and then I don't have to play with leather, because usually what you do when you're making a speed graphic into a woody or you're an SLR woody is take a razor blade, cut around all your hardware, leave the leather underneath it. But that introduces a bunch of other problems, because that's the same thing of on the camera unless you have the camera apart. And if you're not taking all those things apart, yeah. So the fun part starts with one, two, and also you can see how shiny this is now.
Yeah.
But the customer's fabric was it's called gone fishing. it's fishing tackle pattern. There is, and so also the camera goes together and comes other 8 times. The gloss front, unfortunately, that whole front gets covered up by hardware, so that sheen was something else. And so once you start brassing out a camera and you start trying to strip paint off of everything, you begin realizing how much brass there really is on one of these cameras. And once you start, you kind of can't stop unless you're going to give up. So you can start. So usually what people do is they'll take the aperture selector plate off, they'll leave the whole back. But for a camera like this, part of what I wanted to do, part of what the customer wanted was, let's do the whole camera up in beautiful wood, beautiful brass. And so it's pulling off a number of parts that, like, things you didn't think of. And then you get done with spending 25 hours putting out a part to a finish. I don't do a full long brass because you can't repair that. You do about a 4/0 steel wool kind of brush. And that way, if the customer would ever have to refinish the brass themselves, or if they scratch it or something, you can go back in with 4/0 steel wool and blend that back in. It's the same reason why I like tongue oil is if you scratch tongue oil, you hit it with a little 4/0 oil, do another layer of tongue oil. There, photo of this. And then keep going. Notice there's no screws yet, because this is still the point where I have not brassed out all like screws that are on the camera. And then something that you might be familiar with is the wonderful world of bellows making. and
For sure.
The part you always got to do is making the primary set out of paper and seeing if your design actually works. You can see in back here, this one is crumpled up as I was trying to do the test fold, and I was immediately realizing my geometry was all very, very wrong, which is a very normal thing for any maker, in my opinion. And you see this with the patents House was releasing back in 1915. They made a lot of patents for things that physically don't work when they become a real object. They look great on paper, but they just can't exist in the real world.
I mean, I think sometimes they will patent things that intentionally the geometry shown in the patent is not the exact geometry of the thing. Like I copied a Leica shutter in 3D printing using a lot of like the same geometry from the patent. And it wasn't until I started taking them apart that I realized like they don't use a pin in a disc, they use a slot in a disc, and it just works much better. But like it's so that you can't just read the patent and knock them off in 1913 or whatever. You got to buy one. But yeah, I mean, that's like some of the things that you'll see when you start actually like digging through the real patent information, which like gotta love that there's things like Google patent search database that you can go look up all this public material. But what you end up seeing too is they weren't exactly patents to make a product, they were patents to force other people from not making a competing product. So Graflex was patenting things left and right to keep other US manufacturers and designers
from patenting similar things. There's a couple different like hood designs that Graflex made that they didn't use for 10, 15 years, and it was just to keep everyone else from using the same design. So to the picture I've got up right now, I'm a fan of the school of using tape to lay out your pattern for doing bellows. So tape them all down and then peel them all back, spray your glue, and this is, I got the cutout. What was that?
And anybody who's driving or is unable to listen at this point, you really, if you're at all interested in bellows making, this is worth taking some time and going to our YouTube channel.
Yeah, it's a particularly good process slideshow.
Yeah. And this is the process I used to feel a little bit more secret about. It was kind of one of those things where like I felt like, oh, I found this information for myself, but there's so many makers at this point who are making bellows, and honestly, I hate making bellows. Like, they're fun. I will do them. I've made plenty of them, but like, I just, making bellows is a delicate process. It's something I really only want to do if I have to do it.
And it's unprofitable, and I feel exactly the same way.
But but it's also really nice to see that like you'll see in this photo that I've got up right now, I've got the four sides of the bellows cut out, and they're laid down with strips of masking tape over the top, like clean release painter's tape. And underneath that, I've already got it in this stage. It's the first, my outer of the bellows is glued down to the ribs of the bellows. And the back is a can of Super 77 spray glue.
And and it looks like the fabric is like a flower print dress from maybe 1915. So did you go to the vintage store and take a dress apart, or?
And also, all of Graham's weights for holding it down look like camera lenses.
Yeah, I'll flip back to this. You have two different throwaway Buell projection lenses. There's a delineoscope lens, which is a terrible lens. Don't ever buy delineoscope lenses. That's a PSA. Then the other lens is a process lens from, I think they make semiconductors at that factory. It's family member worked for whatever factory, some guy gave him a lens and he dumped it on me. It turns out it's worthless, but it weighs about 2 or 3 pounds and it's great for using as a paperweight. No, so the fabric you're talking about that looks like a vintage flower dress, it's actually it is this light blue with its fishing lures, fly fishing lure print, and all different. They're in yellow and red and all this crazy stuff, and essentially looks like a pair of boxer shorts is what I think. Yeah. Looks like you pulled someone's pants down.
Was that a customer
also,
request?
Please note.
Yeah.
So the customer was the one who actually he went to a fabric store and went and dug for some stuff. We agreed on a couple of colors. We wanted something kind of loud because why are you going to spend all the money refinishing a camera if you're not going to make it some bit unique? It doesn't have to be something that like is going to be resellable for him to retail. Like it's not a camera that he's looking to dump off on eBay or anything. So it doesn't need to be an acceptable color. It's something that he liked. And honestly, when you see the camera in the end, it kind of looks like a tackle box. Good. Also, PSA, always wear a respirator if you're using any sorts of adhesives. This is especially stuff that end up working. Windows open in the background too, and I'm respirator. At this point, I don't mess around with not wearing a respirator when I'm dealing with any sort of harmful VOCs. All right, so this is the camera very, very slowly coming back together. The bellows got formed. I've got stuff kind of laid out. This is the bellows being mounted. This is not the cleanest work to really see the behind the scenes of, but this was never clean. When you're tearing apart the camera this little anyway, none of it was very clean behind the scenes in the first place. So like the front flange, this is the front of the bellows are kind of almost haphazardly looking cut and trimmed, but that all gets covered up with felt. And this is showing the absurdness of the pattern. A little forwards here, starting to get mounted up. This is the front standards back on the camera, and the bellows inside of this. I didn't have a good photo of it. What was that?
I think that the presentation. Okay, now I got an update on the bellows being inside the camera. There we go. It was just slow and up.
Is it?
Hey, so
My
I have a
internet
question
might be a
about
little
this.
slow. My wife is distancing, but
One of the issues I've had in bellows making, and I've actually talked to Lucas Landers quite a bit about materials for this, is that a lot of times original bellows were paper or sort of bookbinding cloth, something that was very thin, although light tight. And so I build bellows almost exactly like you do, right? An outside protective layer, some ribs, although I use a laser cutter, which saves me millions of hours of cutting patterns. And then I use like an internal layer. And that sandwich is actually like pretty thick. And so if you challenged me, let's say, to make a Deerdorf bellows, well, I could make a bellows that would work perfectly. The camera would never fold up with the materials that I'm using. And I wonder if, one, they were just using thicker bellows back then. They probably were using something like leather, or you had a similar struggle, like trying to figure out how to make a bellows that not only would work, but would fold up inside of the camera.
And we're actually gonna so the next part, the photo that I've got up right now, if it's linked for you guys, is because you guys like drafts of things. So the photo is intentionally not showing all of my actual real notation on dimensions, because that's proprietary secret. Especially when you get this far involved in the camera, dimensioning this stuff is an art on its own. But what you're seeing is, and this is part of making that I like and I do enjoy, especially when I went through high school and I got to take a machinist class. My same teacher who taught me to use a lathe and a mill also taught drafting class. So I took a real drafting class, like by hand. I also did take a computer-assisted drafting class where we worked on CAD, like old CAD. So it's funny when Fusion 360 is a mind blower now compared to the CAD that I learned on. But it's no computer software is a replacement for actually getting out a pencil, paper, or ruler by hand and measuring stuff. Because you're exploring the design that you're making at that point. That's what I like. You start to see the real physical things, and especially when it comes into bellows and hood making, when you have those extra thicknesses and you have certain joints and dimensions that, yeah, you can measure it, and you got the dimension off of what you're doing, but there's so much of the practical sense of like actually trying to make it happen. And I think part of what you hit on too is we're at a lack of like, I can manufacture some hard components and some soft components for the stuff that I have, but those materials, like the shutter curtain material I use, is a very, very specific material. Has some extremely specific properties to it, and the same thing goes. It's the industry for why that material is being made really changed from how it was 50 years ago, and the same way that the leather and other sorts of coverings that we were using for Graflexes and for bellows and stuff for a ton of years, those just aren't being manufactured or sold to the same industry anymore. Specifically, the pattern of leather that is on Graflexes is it's Moroccan. It's not leather from Morocco. It is called Moroccan. It's a small pebble pattern leather, and it's embossed technically in a factory. The last embossing dies that ever existed were thrown out years back, and technically you literally cannot get that same pattern leather anymore because no one has the embossing dies to do it. And the same way that when you get into like bellows used to be made out of leather because there were mills actually skiving leather that thin and stretching and making leathers that thin. And I have the leather here from the aircraft upholstery shop in town. And one of the great things about that is they have an industrial skiving machine that can skive entire hides down to the thinness for bellows. So I have a lot of leather that is the technically correct thickness, which is usually really hard to get your hands on. And that's why these days it's called bookbinding leather.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how hard I try, I have not been able to find leather in that thickness that is
that's why, I mean, for my own purposes, it's also one of those things where I could strive to do something like that, but when it comes down to reliability's sake, like bellows and hoods are never going to last forever anyway. I mean, we're replacing them on these cameras that they were dying 30, 40 years ago. You can find vintage photos of press photographers in the 1950s and 40s with the leather falling off their camera already and stuff blowing out. Like these were soft components that were only meant to last about a decade or two. And so for me, for right now, and my process and things, like what in lieu of better quality materials, use what you know is reliably good and what's going to work. And that's why we have stuff like BK5, that blackout material from Thor Labs, which that stuff is nearly as cheap as it is, but then also you can buy it in huge quantities to actually cut out of, which if you try and compare that to any sort of a thickness of leather, I mean, there are suppliers and retailers out there where you can find extremely specific leathers that will do these jobs, but they're not cheap. You're spending $700 for a quarter of a hide just because it is a certain mill spec. So I just flipped the photo over here to, this is the cutout panels. So every time that I make like a pattern like this, the full paper pattern that you saw where it was all drafted out, I still have that. That's hanging up in my shop. What you see here is a transfer. I go through, I take a piece of paper, I take my pattern, my main pattern, and I stick a second piece of paper behind it, and I take a little like a scratch awl or a punch, and you sit and punch out every little corner of everything, and you make a tick, and that way
transfer punch.
Yeah. So you have a transfer of the whole thing. That at that point, you just put the lines together, cut it all out. This next photo is the pressed together hood in its bare form. Is this loading for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay, good. We'll continue here. That's after it's been trimmed down a little bit. And then boom, there we go. It's kind of finally sitting up on and it's
great.
It's a little. It looks like, especially when you have the camera here on words.
How dare you make bright colored cameras?
I'm looking at that and I'm thinking of how much better that would have been if it was just orange. Which is, of course,
it's funny because this.
Yeah, go ahead.
This, I mean, I posted photos of this camera when it was all done, and you should have seen how many people are like, "Oh, that's so gross. Why would you do that thing?" And it's, you know what, like, you're not the dude who paid for it. The person who paid for it.
For everybody on Petapixel who tells you to go kill yourself, you make 2 sales, so it's probably good.
Well, and you got to look at a camera like this too. When the camera is around 80-90 years old, it already had been dead in life. Like, it was, when I received it, it was almost destined for a dumpster. Like, it was that gross. It smelled of, it was rotting. It had like, it's the thing pulling stuff apart, and you're finding like piles of dead bugs and rat feces and stuff. And so a camera like this, yeah, it's loud. Like, the bellows and hood are loud, but the bellows and hood are also replaceable. The heart of what went on there is I spent an obscene amount of time making sure working like there are exactly square corners and contours to the box on Graflex like this. And amateur jobs that you'll see these square corners down to a rounded point. And that is irreparable damage. That's something where if you're someone to appreciate that got refit, the quality that determined a $300 wood refinishing job, $1,000 wood refinishing job. Given not charging here is I mean, essentially what a $45,000 camera job would cost, because that's what happens when you stick 300 hours of work into something to get it to a point. I'm gonna pop forwards here. That's the shutter curtain. These are the 2 curtains side by side that I've got up on here. So the other biggest part of refinishing this camera is, like, yeah, you could take a dead camera and refinish it, but can you make a shutter curtain for it? And so on the left we have the completely rounded shutter curtain that is mostly stiff at this point, and on the right we have a brand new, very soft, supple curtain. Continue. This is a, I believe, a 4x5 curtain sitting on top of a brand new 5x7 curtain, to see the sheer difference in size.
Wow.
5x7 home portrait curtain is right around 6.5 feet long, tip to tail, which is also why people are like, I can buy some shutter fabric online and I'll make my own shutter curtain. And it's like, yeah, shutter curtain material is cheap when you only need 6 inches of it. It's not cheap when you need 6.5 feet by 9 inches wide to cut from. And then also just how enormous these apertures are. This is more close to the end.
And just
here are my
just a technical on the shutter curtain. Are you piecing together multiple pieces, or are you putting that out of one single piece of that fabric? Or if that's proprietary, just tell me that. Shut up.
Oh, no. I can totally tell you about that, because my goal when it comes to shutter curtains is to try and produce the closest real replacement that you can get. My shutter curtain ribs are are nearly identical to what was being produced in about the 1920s when the finish on them changed. Like, so my goal is to make a perfect recreation of a Graflex shutter curtain. And when like a curtain, so this is cut from a very long roll. I buy bulk shutter curtain material on a big roll.
Okay.
It comes huge together, and it's cut from a long roll. So part of this is when like that, you have the various different apertures, which are all 4 different cuts per side, and this is all handmade. This is nothing that you can just drop on a laser cutter and have it cut out. Because it also comes into, you could make a pattern to do that on a laser cutter, but every individual camera you would have to readjust that pattern, because all of these cameras, when you get to the internals, change just a little bit by just a little bit. So a curtain like this is hand cut, 6.5 feet long, 4 different apertures in this camera, and they're all hand cut. So I have a couple of curtains around here where you end up you get a little too happy with a razor blade and you make a cut the wrong way, and you have to throw the entire curtain away. Or
you got to
put the
turn
whole
it into Nikon curtains.
Curtain on. Yeah, well, or what I do with them is I just keep them as patterns, because then for myself I have but it's they're a whole thing. There's people that try and do there's some homemade shutter that someone was making trying to attach curtains together, but also the sheer amount of tension and force inside one of these cameras is wild. Like on a speed graphic, like, yeah, you can move it, but when you get to a 5x7, it is kind of the logical end of how big the system can get before you do have dual curtain systems in a 5x7 work better than one single long roll curtain, and it's that inertia thing. It's something I had to deal with and learn, and it's not at all fixable, but every home portrait ever made will throw its curtain against the back of the camera. So every home portrait ever designed can technically destroy itself. And they're a weird thing. I would have to show a video for that. I don't have that queued up right now, but the biggest part of a Graflex home portrait is usually, a Graflex is having the 1/8 inch aperture, 3/4 inch aperture, and you cycle that, you drop them, but then there's the big open aperture, and that's how you do your bulb time setting or your long exposure. On a home portrait, they added an extra little mechanic in there where you can use that big open aperture as an actual shooting aperture. And what it does is it disengages any of the stops from the aperture selector, and it drops the curtain from one end to the other. So you can cock the camera all the way to the top aperture, which is 1/4 inch on these. So 6.5 feet of curtain, press the shutter release, and have 6 feet of curtain rocket by in front of you, which is extremely loud and extremely violent.
A 4-frame multiple exposure at different exposure times. Oh my God, I want one of those.
It's tweaked slow speed. So the idea is you go from a camera that can only do 1/10 of a second or 1/15 of a second down to a camera that can do 1 second, 1 full second to 1.5, depending on adding the extra apertures. This was like part of the patent was that, you can add extra apertures. Like you can wind up to more apertures and run all 3 apertures in front of the film plane. But this is one of those designs that works really well on paper, but physically what you get is a camera that's, so if you take the back off of a home portrait and fire it, what you get is a complete arc. It's like a semicircle that the curtain ejects itself out one roller, makes an arc, and then gets sucked back into the bottom. And it is one of the scariest things to ever watch. So here's some I'm showing some like glamour shots right now of the how absurd the pattern is.
Stay
all the beautiful photos, by the way.
Yeah, we can stay on that.
And the reason why I'm asking you to stay on that frame is one of them. It's taking a little bit of time to load, and this one loaded up, and we've got it. We're showing the detail, and so maybe that's not the ugliest fabric in the world.
I like it.
It's fun.
So there's and for those of you who don't know, there's a whole Minnesota up north fishing culture cabin type of thing that this
yeah, you got
so it. Well. So yeah. All right.
That whole, I mean, we've got the boundary waters up here, the start of the Mississippi River, and so there's a lot of, especially being this far up north where I am, part of living up here is like the locals who live up here are almost tourists themselves of the area because everyone here enjoys the outdoors. And
Right.
it's funny, the gentleman who commissioned this camera, he's in, I believe, Washington, I think. So it's almost the similar kind of northern thing.
Okay.
I'm gonna see if
And and the other thing is being in Duluth, you're on the edge of the North Shore, which is one of the most beautiful parts of our country. I was just I was in Minnesota last summer, and I did a day on the North Shore, went all the way up to Grand Marais, and did pinhole pictures the whole way up and the whole way back. So
fun.
Yeah, exactly. That was Minneapolis to Grand Marais one day. We hit I mean, and that's essentially every state park along the way. So beautiful.
Duluth is an area, and like the North Shore is one of those places where the rest of Minnesota, you get the up north wilderness, like, and a lot of this is like agricultural, and a lot of it's flat or just trees. But once you get up to Duluth, you got big rocky cliff faces out to the, so I mean, big freshwater lake that you can't see across. And then we have the Twin Ports, and then in Duluth too, one of our biggest claims to fame is we have a big lift bridge that was made in like the early 1900s.
Absolutely.
And it still runs today, and that's the only way you can get out onto Minnesota Point. But it's, I don't know, everyone who lives in Duluth appreciates the city. No one's like living here like, Duluth sucks so much, I don't want to live in the city, because a lot of people move to the city, and a lot of people who live here too have lived out in West Coast. This is kind of like where you want to live if you don't want to live in a big city, but you kind of want to live in the West Coast vibe a little bit. That's what I've heard.
Sure, absolutely. And the leaves are about to change, and so
and actually
you're at the Chrome.
Well, and that's actually with where I used to work for the bag manufacturers in town. For anyone that doesn't know, Duluth Pack and Frost River, they make they're very heritage early 1900s wilderness kind of bags, like made out of canvas, leather, brass buckles. They're tried and true. There's a few of these bag patterns that they've made for over 100 years. So the heritage that we have in Duluth is like the industry is around this whole bushcrafting and wilderness and stuff. And that's why like this camera looks hilarious, that it looks almost like a tackle box, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But here, I'm gonna that is the last photo of that set.
Okay.
That's great. I love that set.
Yeah.
Hey, Graham, is any of this online, like as a photo set that people can see, or just exclusive here?
Some of this stuff is posted on my Instagram. I've got a little array of things on my website itself at graflexparts.com that will, like I've got like a little cute slideshow of some of the cameras that I like. I think that's shown in it. Just the nice glamour shots, not the actual nitty gritty, which is what you guys get to see. But otherwise, on my Instagram is where I post most of my like actual day-to-day things that I don't really feel are great advertisements for my normal Facebook.
By the way, the links will be in the description below, and we'll do all of Graham's contact info down there and at the end of the show specifically.
Here, let me pull up. All right, so this next set that I'm sharing here, we're seeing the back of a ground glass, and this is just a coverage test, actually. This is a Linhof back, off of Linhof colored cardan. So the Linhof monorail view camera, usually you can find them on eBay with like crushed bellows. This is the same back that you'll see on the Technicas. So it's a little deceptive at first because you're like, oh my gosh, who would have ripped that off of Technica and like done that with it? That's a blurry photo. This is so I showed. I think I posted it in the group before. I had to mill down a back, a Linhof back, and you mill off the entire faceplate of it, and you can carefully re-drill the whole thing to get back to mount up to the original wood back of a Kershaw camera like this. So this is a 3x4 Kershaw reflex. It keeps a light seal every time that you're adjusting the curtain, as long as the mirror is down, so you're not going to burn a frame, which makes it super desirable. And it actually, once we stuck a 4x5 back on the 3x4 camera, we figured out it was making almost 4x5 exactly. It's just under, it's vignetting on one edge. And that's just a symptom of where it was.
And who cares?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And for the photographer shooting it, they use, because you're using like a modern Graflex back, he actually he has 120 holders, and he most of the time he shoots I think he shoots the 4x5 Polaroid film too, which is crazy to see gorgeous color photos and stuff off of this. I forgot to grab any of his pictures.
I have bought and sold a lot of like Linhof color cardins or other cardins, and they are beautiful. They also never had a good bellows by the time I got to them, but
yeah, and that's why I think they made on them like that weird cream vinyl. I mean, they're so dated to when they were made, but the backs are great. So if anyone can't see this, the essentially a Linhof back is like, or they rotate in a really weird way. They've got these 4 little clips that kind of hold down this rotation ring, but the entire mechanism itself is very stout. When it comes right off of a color cardan, it has this big flange on the front because it's meant to do back movements. So you can move the back a little bit itself and extend it. But when you're sticking on an SLR, you don't want those movements because you want the thing to be locked in a perfect frame the whole time. So you can mill off about 3/4 of an inch from the back and cut the thing down to a working distance. And so, which is something not normal on SLRs like this, is we managed to not have to raise the ground glass, or the ground glass got raised significantly, but we didn't have to move the hood at all. The hood got to stay right where it was. So this is, there we go. This is before I put stripes on it. This was technically the end of the build. There wasn't much more to this other than using a milling machine to take off 3/4 of an inch of aluminum for the back of it. And then the whole thing is you find out how to drill holes very sneaky. So screw holes on the back are actually hidden underneath other things. So it's really clever, but also I don't like making camera modifications that you go in service, because something like this, this camera has come back in for service before to get the shutters adjusted. Somehow a safety side of the camera went missing between me shipping it back to him and then him shipping it back to me. And so there's like it came back, and when you're gonna have to work on a camera again, it's best if the whole thing hasn't been JB welded together, and you don't have to sit and break glue. It's like just take it apart the way it was meant to be taken apart. Oh, and this was if this photo's coming up, this is the only Linhof Kershaw you will ever see. Right. Was more of a mark trying to do that because
Graham stole the badge off the Linhof and mounted it to the Kershaw. Very, very
and
slick,
it mounts in a perfect spot.
Yeah, it looks like factory.
So next, what I'm showing you here is a little bit more behind the scenes that I wasn't posting photos of this a long time ago, but it was almost an afterthought because we put the back on. I started going through film tests, and there is silicon sealant to cover up a certain gap that exists, but the whole camera can still come apart without having to break the silicon sealant. But what we discovered is the back was making a really funny vignette. So we go through the I went through and I cut and stamped and fabricated a set of frame lines, I guess you could call it, that shaped the whole thing down to an actual square. Did some more hidden screws, and this is something where I did this long enough that I would consider this to be crude for my own work. And I'm doing I have another one of these in my queue right now that I'm making a sister to this camera. And my strategy at this point is, instead of doing, this is a 4-part little masking system that I did. The next camera I'm doing is going to be just a mask plate that's been CNC'd out to the exact dimension. So then way I don't have to play with this, and also the whole thing can come apart a lot easier. And this is, there we go. That's the glamour shot. So the client who commissioned this one, everyone's got their childhood fantasies and wants, and so growing up with like the Fast and the Furious, everyone wants to have a fast race car that's got like some cool like racing stripes and like riced out. And so with this, especially, he's a shooter. He does like fine art photography, wedding photography with this rig. This camera has shot a lot of awesome, really cool things. And he wanted his own little hot rod, and so he asked, he's like, can you put some racing stripes on it? And we deliberated about the positioning of the stripes and the color, and he ended up picking this is vinyl sticker. You could like vinyl for like a sticker cutter. And we cut a big lime green racing stripe across the camera, which is also something that most people do not like. You're like, why would you do that? And it's like, also, I mean, the camera, it's still being shot this late in its life.
Yeah, it should be orange. That's the reason why.
I mean, the sister of it that I've got in my queue is not going to get a green stripe on it, but it's going to be the same system. It's the cute little, which is, these cameras are great there. And so this is the Kershaw system where the mirror mechanism in it, the lens sits behind the tip of the mirror. And when the mirror triggers, it pulls it back in a convex arc, and it pulls the leading edge of the mirror that's flipping up. It pulls it back in an arc around the rear of the lens and up to the front. So you can put some freakishly short lenses on this camera. Still not super tiny, but it is short.
It's wild.
Yeah, that's a fun one. Kind of on the same topic with that is, let me pop over to my other. I've got another folder here. And let's see if I can make screen sharing. I'm going to start a new presentation and pop over to this guy. Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is a kind of similar thing. This is back when you could get so that's a Lomo Bel Air Instant Back, ripped off of the Bel Air camera that they're doing. And this is when you could still get them for under $600, and before Lomo InstaWide or the Loma Graflock, or whatever they're calling this thing now. Before that was even an issue. So what we've got here is it's a 3x4 Thornton and Pickard with some laser cut Baltic birch plywood that's been stained, and this whole thing's been. I'm really proud of this one because this camera came together really nicely with like a perfect adapter plate out of something that can be removed, and especially a Bel Air back, they're really obtuse to try and modify. So this whole camera, it's like, how do you put something together where you can't see any of the screws that are holding the whole thing together, and you can't access the screws from either directions? So this camera comes apart by the back comes off in a really specific way, and then the Bel Air back has hidden screws going from inside the Bel Air to into the back. So it's kind of like Inception of mounting a back on something. These cameras are super cute though, but they are flawed by design. I like Thorntons. They were a clever idea, but this is, I think Nick was talking about it before, doing a small mirror inside of a reflex camera, and that's what Thorntons decided to do to overcome that the short flange distance hurdle that they were trying to do. They made a very tiny mirror, and the mirror flips up, and the way to occlude the gap that goes around the mirror, because the mirror is too small to see, they just have a big piece of floppy felt that sits underneath it. And so it's that felt that's relying on a light seal for the entire viewing hood. So Thornton Pickard cameras by design have a light leak from the viewing hood, along with other 8 light leaks. And the camera's a one-way street. So if you
I can feel for him, because the cameras I build are generally have 8 light leaks as well in the design.
Well, and this was also a time where this is years ago when something could still be considered high-end and have these hurdles that were commonplace hurdles. Now you have a camera that has a rogue light leak, and compared to where modern manufacturing is going, like, it's unacceptable that a camera can have that leak. But something like this, there's especially now what's happened is, and I guess I'll stop my screen sharing here and pop back on camera. And this is gonna be a little blurry, but this is the Thornton Pickard that I showed before. What's going on in here is I have developed about 17 different new parts for this camera, because there's the way the mirror works in the camera, it's relying on a cloth hinge to make sure that there's a light seal, instead of actually creating a mirror box and tray that seat and create a physical light seal, like door trap. This is relying on just a piece of cloth to just kind of fill the space. And it never works. And also, every time that you have to service the shutter on a Thornton Pickard camera, it has to come out of the camera, which it does. It's modular, but it's glued to the hunk of fabric in there. So part of what I've done to this camera system is trying to update all of these different things. I mean, you end up causing certain handicaps the camera has. Like, to defeat the cloth hinge, I created a metal hinge that just stays in the camera and never gets removed. But that also cuts off your view through the viewfinder. You kind of get a little bit of a vignette on the bottom. But the alternative of burning at this point, I mean, this camera was intended initially for doing like Fuji instant film, but when you're burning $60 boxes of film, like, you can't really afford to have like one frame that got super screwed up. Or when you're shooting a wedding or something, you can't afford every 3 out of 10 frames to be totally screwed up and waiting for something specific to happen. But even with like the Thorntons, they are a one-way street. You wind the camera, the shutter speeds start at the fastest and go to the slowest. So you wind going past the fastest speed, 1/1000th down to 1/10. If you wind too far, you have to fire the camera to reset the tension to go back. So you can't just consistently adjust the speed. A Graflex, because there's no light seal in this camera, you're gonna have to have dark slide in the whole time every time you want to trigger it to set the speed again. But on a Graflex, you have that whole mirror box that stays together. So this is why like Thorntons are a very cool design. They do some things, but they're so heavily flawed at this point that it's one of those things where you work on enough and you take it apart a few hundred times and you learn how they really should be working. But it's like, I don't ever want to touch one.
Do you want to build one from scratch though?
And this is where it's at. Yeah, this is what it guts to is I love some of the parts. The Thornton Pickard shutter curtain design is awesome. It actually is incredibly reliable when it's working right. But it's the hurdle of they weren't allowed to use the mirror box that Kershaw was using, so they had to get a different system around that, and they handicapped themselves at the same time doing that. They created a camera that just has umpteenth amount of flaws, but hey, we used our own patent of this, and then the whole history of it goes that in like the mid 1930s, all of these companies got bought up by the same entity, and you have an amalgamation of 4 or 5 different, I forgot what they're called offhand, it's AA and something, but they were all re-centralized all of their camera patents together, and you get some weird cameras that existed for like 2 years, and they are bizarre. It's like a Franken camera of all of these cameras that existed before. I don't know, you even start to see it in cameras from the 1920s that these companies were stealing, like apparently the patent for their hood designs went up in 1915 because everyone started using the exact same hood design in 1915. I don't know. And that's where we're at a point where I think intellectual property and being protective of your own designs and stuff is valid and important, but we're at a time where we can start finally using technologies and putting these things together that no one was ever legally allowed to do
in 1940.
Yeah, no. And even Graflex, Graflex is notorious. Their first shutter curtain design is stolen from somebody else, but they only got away with it for about 2 years before they changed to a different system. So it was like, we'll do it, we'll still start selling it until we end up in some sort of legal ramifications with someone else. And also when you get into that whole history, you end up with like William Fulmer was a shark when it came to patents. He was buying everybody left and right. He essentially put an end to most of his competition in the US. It's a little wild, like the different companies that he just stamped out effectively by 1920, just because he's like, I want your, it's like, I like your mirror system. I'm going to take your mirror system. I like your curtain system. Like the long roll shutter curtain that Graflex has is not Graflex's design. That is someone else's design from the 1890s. But Graflex also was the same company that left the patent dates on their camera 30 years past when the patents expired. So.
So, Graham, is there anybody that you would like to give a shout out to? Anybody who's been, particularly important in the development of where you're at now with camera stuff or other life stuff? Anybody you want to give a shout out to? Yeah,
there's actually, I guess predominantly is one of the things when, like, first customers I ever had. There's a gentleman named Twan B of Twan B and Company Photography in Chicago. Dude is solid, shoots some insane gear, but also has the most conventional art opinions ever. But he's always like the one, like I'll message him with like, I have this dumb idea for this, and yeah, I'll support that. But I got a couple cameras for him that let me kind of do some, like someone who actually like will own up to taking the risk of like, hey, you can mess with this, like fix it for me. That was huge. That definitely gave me a leg up. He's always been like the biggest proponent for like advertising and dropping my name here and there. Other people that I'm really fans of right now in the whole maker community, Ross Burley, Burley Camera Company. That dude rocks. And I also love that he's given me some tips. I've reached out to him before for woodworking, and I mean, the guy's running his own little operation, so he's got all his secrets that he needs to keep for himself. But he is doing some seriously good, really nice woodworking. And then I guess what really helped me in everything that I've been doing is the communities that exist, like Graflex Camera Community or Graflex Camera Group, the one that we have on Facebook. There's a few different gentlemen in there, like Thomas Evans, Ken Huff, that they're people that knew what these industry things were. They have all this information from years ago. And Ken Huff, actually, he's Deerdoff's historian. And he's worked at the factory for a while. And there's a whole other history that goes into that. But he is one of those guys that you can reach out to about anything. And he's got whatever the old timer repair tech idea was from 50 years ago. He's not necessarily the guy that you can like reach out to, but I appreciate that there's like old timers like that around.
Okay.
I don't know. I guess I also am appreciative of my wife because for the past, the whole first couple of years of this working, we live in a 750 square foot apartment, and about a third of that apartment was my shop for a long time until we could get an actual space that I have down here.
Sure.
She's appreciative because now she's with the things right now. She's distance teaching. She's a high school English teacher. So she's upstairs holding class right now.
Yeah. I hate Zoom. I love Zoom. I hate Zoom. Yeah, that's where I'm at with teaching via distance. So, all right. Let's see. We don't have any books this week. Ethan, do you want to say any shout outs, anything?
No, I just want to know all of the places that people can find Graham, because he runs probably the second biggest Facebook group about making, or the, I don't want to say second biggest, it's probably larger than our group, but like there's only two of them about making Frankenstein cameras on Facebook, and you have Graflex Parts and you have Graflex user groups, and there's about 1 million ways to find you on the internet. Graham, what are all of those ways?
First, my website, aptly at www.graflexparts.com. That's just my main front to everything. You're going to find contact information, links to my Facebook, links to my Instagram, my contact email address, and all that stuff. The easiest way to get in contact with me is directly through Facebook, because I do most of my stuff on Facebook. I admin specifically. There's Graflex Camera Group. We're just at over, I think, 3,100 users right now. We try and centralize away from sales posts, away from appraisal stuff. We have, I mean, there's hundreds of years of knowledge in that group of people who have been doing and helping people and used to know the old repair techs from 30 years ago. On top of Graflex Camera Group, I also run Dr. Frankenstein's Camera Club, which is things that don't really fit into Graflex Camera Group. I mean, other large format reflex cameras, but it also, I like the whole idea that most of what we centralize and post in the group is about large format cameras, weird antique stuff, really funky lenses and things. But I like keeping it open. It's an open door for people who are on the entry level. The person who just got their first Helios lens and they're getting the first mirrorless adapter set up. It's a little weird to know how far that can extend for yourself, which I love. I shoot a Sony E7 and I shoot a micro Nikkor 55-2.8. I love digital with passion too for all my normal stuff, product photography. But at the same time, you have a tool for each specific thing, and that's why Dr. Frankenstein's Camera Club is like the end all of this for me, is because
I wanted to point out that Dr. Frankenstein's Camera Club is like the closest Facebook group to the Homemade Camera podcast Facebook group in terms of like people sharing nutty stuff that they're doing with cameras. And I mean that like in the best, most interesting ways. I lurk there quite a bit.
Good.
I have to jump out. I'm sorry. I have to jump out. I have a FaceTime with my mother. She's at the doctor.
I'll wrap it up, Dan.
Great talking with you, but
I'm still good talking with you.
Going to jump off. So
yeah, we went easily another hour past where we thought we could maximally go, but
yeah,
we're gonna have to do another one of these.
Talk about Ethan, do the
Homemade Camera zine.
Yeah, the zine. Okay,
I'll do it.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Okay, bye. All right, Graham, I rudely interrupted you because I'm such a fan of Dr. Frankenstein's Camera Group. Where else can people find you?
My Instagram is my Instagram handle is Graflex_parts. For some reason, Graflex Parts is one word was taken when I tried to do it. My Instagram is I post on my story all the time. That's where you can really see kind of. There's legitimacy when you can see a maker at work making their stuff and doing stuff. So that's why I love posting more nonsense there. That's a little bit more topical. I keep more things announcement related on my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/GraflexParts, all one word. And that's where you'll usually see announcements of if I'm coming out with a back, if I'm releasing a batch of rangefinder cams, some odd parts. Every now and then I have some random assortment old stock parts for sale. I usually try and centralize on new production, organic, new things, so we don't have to keep cannibalizing old cameras. Otherwise, my email address is graflexparts@gmail.com too. And these are all great avenues to reach out to me. I don't get back to my email nearly as much as I should because it's mostly just tech support questions. But
if I'm not getting that router from 10 feet of snow.
Yeah, right. No, but the thing is, if I'm not getting back to you, reach out to me more. I always love to help. I'm just inundated with tech support all day as trying to run my own shop. But those are about, I think, all the places.
Well, thank you very much, Graham. I'm going to do a quick list of things before Graham needed to run, which is that the Homemade Camera Podcast zine #2. Graham's putting that together, and it is the deadline has been extended. I'm not sure for how long, but probably another month. We've already gotten some excellent submissions, and they're still rolling in. So Graham is at least a month. I think he's going to extend the submissions. If you have a camera to submit, submit a picture or pictures of the camera with the camera, of your drawings of your process, and a little bit of a blurb about what the camera is, why you made it, what the process was like, and what it's like to shoot with. And you can send those submissions with pictures attached to hmczine2020. That's hmczine2020@gmail.com. Graham Young, how can people find you?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram as Graham Homemade Camera. I'm on Flickr as Freezer of Photons, all one word, all jammed together. And have we talked how to get a hold of Nick?
No, you tell him.
Okay, so Nick is AvyNick, AvyNick on Instagram. He's Nick Lyle on Flickr, that other one, the Flickr thing. Yeah, absolutely. We want to thank Robbie Cribbs. Robbie Cribbs, he is the one who did our music. He created our music. He played our music, and he allows us to use it every week. And so thank you very much, Robbie.
Thanks, Robbie.
where I was from, it depended. If enough kids could get picked up by the bus in town, the plows could get out early enough. Like, yeah, you'd have school, but usually it was like only like 2 hour late start. The only time school would actually be called is if we had I think one year we had 2 days of -35, where tiles were actually popping off the walls in the school because something went wrong. Like whole school was freezing. And then the other time I remember having like a significant amount of time off was we had 3 fog days in a row because for some weird reason it was foggy for 3 days straight and like too dangerous to drive.